All right. Well, I will do my best to entertain everybody that is not watching right now. I can see I have exactly 0 viewers, but you know what? That's okay. I'm going to stick with this and I'm going to see this through because I am absolutely obsessed with bringing changes to the way that people are interacting with and getting involved with local civic politics because this is really where the rubber hits the road in terms of how our lives are made better or made significantly worse. So I think it's super important. And I mean, honestly, my mission here is just to get as many people. Honestly, I don't give a shit if you watch me or if you watch the council meeting live. I mean, my hope is that, I bring a little bit more entertainment value to council meetings and to these workshops and, add a different perspective as to, what I think and what I see going on as somebody who works extensively in the industry. And frankly, I deal with local governments a lot. I do a lot, like a lot. I deal with local governments. So, I think I can offer a very compelling and well thought out and educated view on how these different policies and different things that are going on are going to affect everybody's life. And I mean, I hope that I am self aware enough to be able to identify when I'm being selfish and self serving and when I am really voicing my concern for everybody. And I would like to think that I am fairly selfless most of the time, but yeah, I mean, we'll see what goes here. So
for Monday, February 23rd at 5
workshops
o'clock.
coming together here.
The agenda that's been circulated, any errors or omissions from the agenda is presented. Hearing none, will someone move its adoption? Moved by Councilor Back, second by Councilor Mott.
Looks like Councilor Muri's at home.
Contrary-minded, motion is carried.
You can see my face is maybe blocking out a couple people.
We're going to start off with a bit of a recap because I know it's been a little bit since we had this discussion with lots of other stuff going on. And so we do have a presentation from staff. It's going to take about 10 minutes, I'm assured, to start things off. Oh, okay. No?
A little bit more than that. We've got it broken into 3 10-minute sections.
3 10-minute
And it's actually not
sections.
even that long. It's a lot of slides, but it's a little bit of, this is what you saw, this is what you asked for, here's the information, and so on. And then getting to the parking, which we didn't get to.
There you go.
You don't have to watch the shark video then, do we?
No.
Okay. So we'll do our best to hold our questions for the 10-minute sections, but if you do have a very quick clarifying, didn't understand the term or something like that, then interject. But otherwise, the bigger questions, we'll do our best to keep them to those breaks. But at this point, Yan Tenzin, go ahead.
Sure, yeah, I'll just do a quick intro and hopefully this will come online. And so it is the continuation tonight. It is.
It's okay, you can do it, you just have to exit out of that and then go into this.
Good evening. Good evening.
We're watching a video of Malawi, all right.
Back to the sharks.
This will test my vision.
So our presentation tonight is the, there we go. The continuation of our discussion with Mayor and Council, the February 10th workshop, zoning workshop. And what we're doing is that we're following up on employment-related zones tonight. And, we heard the great discussion last time, lots of great commentary and questions as well. So what we want to do is we're bringing some clarification points, some responses, and also some maps as requested. And what we're hoping to do specifically is that for commercial zones, commercial mixed-use zones, we're going to conclude on the ground floor retail uses. And as you will see, so this is in our town center and neighborhood center, as you will see staff.
So far, it's a lot of not helpful stuff here. So, they're just doing a bit of a recap. But today, things that I want us thinking about are the AI money pit. How much money should we be approving the municipality to spend on AI? Given that I think the AI boom is about to bust, I don't think we should be spending too much money investing in AI stuff. There's transportation demand management bylaws that are being considered. There's a two-step commercial stagnation piece being considered, ground floor retail only restrictions, and shelf ready zones and NAICS alignments. So those are the things that I want us paying attention to and thinking about. I've got some things to discuss as we get going here, but that I just wanted to set the groundwork for this evening's council workshop.
With us is, again, Adam Matheson from BMA Studio, and John Chiraki will be leading the parking section of the presentation. And we're still supported by Matt Culhaney, but they're not with us tonight. So are they available virtually, Tennyson, or? Okay. So that's it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you once again for having us and for giving us really critical feedback as we work through the zoning bylaw. There are a lot of slides, but they're going to go through very, very quickly. So don't stress about the number. Really what we're bringing back tonight are answers to some of the questions that we've heard and showing where we are tweaking based on the input we had last 2 weeks ago. So one of the questions we heard as we were leaving the room was a question that somebody made the comment of, why are you concerned about non-conforming uses for businesses when you don't seem as concerned about them for buildings? And so I just wanted to clarify that. And by the way, the numbers in brackets relate to the sections of the Act. Essentially, in zoning, one of the mantras is that you can't vary use or density. So when you change a use in zoning and you no longer permit a use, the only way to allow that to be permitted is to go through a rezoning. So it's a much more onerous thing than, say, a setback change. The other thing that's interesting is if your building is non-conforming, say because the basement is too deep, you can still renovate the entire thing and you can expand the upper stories. You just can't expand the area of non-conformity. So say you had one setback, say the front yard setback was non-conforming, you could still expand your building to the sides, to the rear. You could create a taller building without worrying about that non-conformity. Whereas with businesses, once they become non-conforming, they cannot expand, they cannot increase the intensity, and they have problems relocating. And then there are other spin-off impacts to this, like problems getting a loan to do a tenant improvement or to further invest in the site. So it has more of an impact. But in both cases, we think very long and hard about whether we should introduce any non-conforming use, because we recognize there is an issue associated with them. But in some cases, so just that's really just for reference in case you have more questions on that. So wanted to turn to the discussion we had last week 2 weeks ago on starting with commercial, and we'll turn to industrial. Again, the notion here was that we look at how zoning can support the work that our vision and policy documents talk to in terms of expanding our commercial use and adding vibrancy to our community, while at the same time supporting businesses and simplifying regulations. One of the things I think I glossed over a little bit last week was that notion of zoning is just one piece of the puzzle. And here are two pictures from Marine Drive, but you could just as well be looking at Queensdale at the end of the street. We've had zoning since the 60s that allowed 4-story, 1.75 FSR development on most of our existing commercial sites, but many of them have not redeveloped. And this is just an indicator that there's a lot more that triggers the reason for redevelopment beyond just the opportunity that zoning provides. So we can use zoning to really set the stage, to create that opportunity, to make sure that buildings, if they do get redeveloped and built, the building is sited in such a way that it supports the public realm and works hand in hand with design guidelines to really get the intimacy and vibrancy that you want. But it's just one piece. So then when you think about what the other pieces are, and many of you know them much better than I do, but they are those market condition pieces. They are pieces like the size of existing lots. If you have lots of small lots, it's harder to get that assembly you need to make the parkades work. So assembly is another piece. The cost of redevelopment, and we talk about that a lot, but in areas of Marine Drive, for example, there are hidden costs that may not always be obvious. So everywhere in the lower mainland, we have this high cost of construction that we're dealing with. But in Marine Drive, you have a lot of sites that used to be auto mechanics or other sites that have past contamination. When you combine that with a high water table, you can have contamination in a plume that becomes more costly to redevelop and address. So there are pieces like that that can be a hindrance to redevelopment. One of the owners that comes in from time to chat to us has always referenced a concern with capital gains tax, and it's a reason he has chosen not to redevelop some of his properties. And then the other piece of this is that it takes time. You know, the old adage, Rome wasn't built in a day. Well, many of the most vibrant village and town centers we love to visit are ones that have had a while to come to their own. And they also have a population density it's supporting them. And sometimes that's about the village itself is not in the turmoil of redevelopment. But the other piece is the population density. And if you look at the stats for many of those streets you love to visit, they're over 10,000.
Like what
people
streets?
per kilometer.
Which
Because
streets?
if you think about areas like Lionsgate, Lynn Creek, we're just getting to about 3,000 per kilometer in those areas. And it doesn't mean that they will never be vibrant, but it does mean it may take a little bit longer for those town centers to build out and get to that level of vibrancy that we want. Or that we need to think about what other attractions are going to come into those areas.
That's 4x to
make them more
10x.
destinations for other people to visit.
They
So
do.
It's a pulling apart the different pieces, and zoning is just one of them. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about how the impacts of curating that use and whether it was the right thing to continue to admit a broad mix of uses. We talked about how 30 to 40% of commercial uses would become non-conforming if we limited ground floor to just retail and restaurant. We also talked about that 1% vacancy rate and how few options there were for other businesses, which led us to the recommendation and the conclusion that for the general commercial zone, which will apply to most of our existing commercial sites, we would continue to have it be mixed use. We would continue to require grade level commercial, and we would continue to permit a broad mix of commercial uses. So on the right, we have a diagram that shows kind of what it would look like and the list of zones that it would replace. But one of the things that was requested 2 weeks ago was a map. So here is a map. It's not particularly bright. It's a little bit better on your printout, I hope. This is the zoning map, and we've just asked that the sites that would go to this are popped out. And then we also have one that has insets. And for some reason, the names aren't showing up, but I can give you another version that has the names on it. But essentially, this is just drilling in, so you can see that this zone would apply to Marine Drive. It would apply to Queens.
You mean you haven't done your homework and made sure that this is presentation ready before presenting it to council? Bro.
Right? It's only applying to the existing commercial zones. Does that make sense? What's puzzling?
Please say it again.
So if you have Queensdale, it's currently zoned a mixture of zones like C2 and C3, which are for mixed use development at 4 stories. Queensdale Market itself has only been built out at 1 story, but it is permitted to have a 4-story development. So in that notion of we're not dropping people's development rights and we're maintaining their potential, we would match that old commercial zone to a new commercial zone. But when you look at, say, Lynn Valley Mall, So the BOSA came in and went through a rezoning process a few years ago and rebuilt the south half of the mall under a CD zone. So it's not showing up. But the north part of the mall is still zoned, I think it's C3, for a shopping mall, as is Safeway. So those sites would be given the new zoning that is the same density they have. They are not being pre-zoned to their potential under the OCP, just matching the zoning they have so they can continue to do the business they do. Yeah.
And also maybe, sorry, also maybe just add to that response is that the pre-zoning would allow council, mayor and council that additional layer of decision-making. So we're not pre-zoning at all with the zoning bylaw rewrite. So just to,
Yeah,
that's why
the
it's
rezoning
like for like
process allows it.
conversion to a new bylaw. Sorry, the mayor. I'm sorry,
You
Your
qualified it
worship.
with the word recent for CD zones. And so, just to be clear, when you're saying recent, you're meaning the Maplewood development and Lynn Valley development, but not the Marine Drive development, because half of those are CDs on that Marine Drive.
The ones shown in red are all sites that are C9 or C2 or C3 and would be going to this. So they are not
But like
CD zones.
District Crossing, which was BOSA,
Yeah,
sorry, an
and
Ani
it's a
development.
gap there.
That
It should be.
was a CD zone.
Yeah, this one here.
I thought we had 3 CD zones on the north side of the road alone. District Crossing's on the north side.
Which is under C9. The
Well, I thought it
Quaylex
was on
project?
I thought it had its own comprehensive development on that one. We put forward C9 under the Marine Drive plan, and then we had like 3 projects in a row that came forward with comprehensive developments because they said they couldn't build it under the C9 at the time.
I know we did variances on a number of them, and we can double check individual sites, but for the most part, Marine Drive is C9 or the gas stations are C3 or C3A, depending on if they have a service bay. And so those ones would be going to the general commercial zone.
So that does open up the question. So then C9 with a variance, is that what you just said?
So some of like the, if you think back to say those Ani developments,
Yeah.
they had building height variances and they might have had parking variances, but by and large, they were built out under the C9 zoning. And when you look at the zoning map today, they are zoned C9. And so they would be converted to the new general commercial zone.
But those
Sorry,
variances.
which are the Ani developments?
And some of the newer ones that are the 4-story, they have
Where?
on Marine Drive. Sorry, we're talking Marine
Uh,
Drive. So close to Pemberton, but a
Lloyd.
block over at Lloyd. There's also one on the south side of the street.
Okay.
I think the, one's called The Drive. And then
That's
there's
on
The Drive 2, which is on the south side. And then there's one that's mostly residential on Churchill at Lloyd. So there's a mix of them there. I think really the key point here is that if I go back a slide, these are the zones that will be replaced by the new general commercial zone. And so you can, and we're trying to do it in a way that gives the businesses within one neighborhood the same set of uses to work with. So all of Edgemont would have the same commercial zone, and most of Marine Drive will have the same commercial zone. I will also add that we're not rezoning this comprehensive development zones in this first phase, but we are looking at doing them in a future phase so that they will benefit from the same use categories and the same easier definitions and so on. But because that means going into each one and looking and pulling apart a little bit, that's a very large chunk of work, and we're going to look at what makes the most sense for that probably over the next year.
But the C9 with variances, how will the variances be handled going forward? Will they sit
That's a
non-conforming?
great question.
Okay.
And I'm so glad you asked, because it lets me talk a little bit more about the zones we've written. So one of the things we've thought about is what are the variances we keep seeing? And they tend to come into 2 categories. One is about floor to ceiling height for the commercial. Our old zones were written at a time when floor to ceiling heights were only 10 feet, even for commercial, whereas almost every commercial application we've seen come in has floor to ceiling heights that are between 12 and 15 feet, right? You've all seen them. You go into these new shops that much higher, lots more air comes in. So if we just create a taller building height, that can happen by itself and you don't need the variance anymore. So that's what we've done. We've given, it's limited to 4 stories, but the height is taller, recognizing that higher floor to ceiling height. And then the second cluster of variances tended to be about what's called a blended parking bay. And John will be talking about that more in the latter half of the conversation. But essentially, what we did time after time after time on applications, either when they were comprehensive development zones or as variances to C9, was we brought in something where we looked at all of the CRUs that might happen. And we said, well, over time, one of those might be a restaurant and the rest might be retail. Those in our current zoning bylaw have 2 different parking rates. And if you did nothing, then conceivably a restaurant could go into, say, 2 CRUs instead of just 1 and eat up the permitted parking or required parking for more of the units, thereby leaving those units unable to ever be rented out, which doesn't make sense when you're actually trying to create that vibrant, walkable area. So if we instead blend the rates and require an average across the entire building that is sufficient to meet the needs of both uses, then we can stop worrying about each tenant improvement and instead just recognize that overall within the community and over time, this will work. And so that's what we've been doing for about 15 years now. We're now trying to codify that through the zoning amendments that John will be chatting about in a little bit.
Additional comments from Mr. Milburn and then question from Councillor Mott.
Your Worship, just want to clarify your question. I think your question was just a little bit different. You gave a lot of good information there.
Sorry.
But I believe the question was, if it's an existing development and had a variance to make it happen, what does that mean if once you change this zone? And I think the answer is essentially the variance was given for the development of the day, and it was permitted, and it was built, and that's fine. But of course, if somebody comes in for a new development, they want to tear that down and build something new, they're going to have to apply for the development of the day.
It will sit as non-conforming until the next time it's rebuilt.
Yeah, sorry, I just got too excited, you know.
That's okay, we appreciate the passion. Councillor Ma, then Councillor Murray. Councillor Ma, go ahead.
Thank you, and I think I'm getting caught up in that passion because every time you say something, a question pops in my head.
Great.
Well, when you said that, did you mean this? So I'm going to try to focus on just a couple of things. My understanding is that part of this rezoning exercise, because it's been since 1965, is kind of bringing everything together and maybe reduce the number. So sounds great, but I want to understand something. Is it the opinion of staff that the C9 zoning for Marine Drive, and I use this word, whatever way you want to describe it or define it, has it been successful in your mind? And if so, is that a formula that you're trying to use for other areas? Because I might have a different opinion, so I'm curious to hear that.
So several ways to answer that. There are pieces of it that were very good work and that should continue to be thought about. So for example, when C9 came in, it no longer permitted some of the car-oriented uses that had been permitted in the old zones. So it no longer permits car dealerships. It no longer permits drive-ins. It no longer permits drive-throughs. It no longer permits the other ones that were dropped. I mean, a drive-in theater, but I'm not sure we had one on Ray Drive, you know? Essentially, it was trying to shift us towards a more pedestrian-oriented street. Did we get exactly that happen? Well, again, come back to that earlier slide where I was talking about the things that trigger change. We have had several sites develop, and some of those have a good mix of uses, but the street itself is it's kind of one block's on and then we've got a couple blocks off. And so how do we get the rest of the street to change? And that, again, comes back to some of these other pieces that are beyond zoning. But we are trying to think about what has merit to keep from any of the old zones. So for example, across the district, we have a prohibition on large format retail stores, and we're keeping that. We're not throwing it out. So there are pieces like that that we're keeping from the old bylaw, but we are trying to look for ways we can improve and simplify.
What's large retail format?
So like a big box store like Canadian Tire, or, you know, a Home Depot.
I'm gonna give an opinion that C9, if it was meant to reduce car dealership and reduce car, people driving to the market or the store, my opinion is it hasn't achieved that. Car dealerships are still there, but they're different dealerships. They seem to be flipping it among themselves. So I don't know if that's permitted. It seems like it,
Yeah,
the
it comes back
community
to
took over
that
for this.
non-conforming use piece, right? So you can bring in the new zoning, but you don't force people out. Rather, they have the right to continue that use unless they close or
Yeah, no
cease to
shit.
use for more than 6 months.
It seems like they either flip within their own brand or their own company. Like they're still there.
What might be useful is we previously showed before and after photos from the sites that did redevelop. And it really showed that there's this sort of what I would call arterial commercial, where it's very car focused. There'd be large expansive parking lots in front with some retail at the very back, or car sales or other uses, very, very car focused. And then if you look at the sites that did redevelop, which is how many, about 40% of the frontages?
Yes.
About 35 to 40% of the frontages did redevelop to the commercial on the front with residential above, which isn't, I agree with you, it's not perfect, but it's certainly a dramatic improvement from what was there on those blocks before.
Why?
I'll agree to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But the businesses that came in,
According to who is that a significant improvement?
fitness, health related, whether it's a medical office or ginseng or whatever, there's a whole bunch of different, and I would say childcare. They've taken up a lot of the retail space. So this is, I think, this was brought up before on the 10th. We totally understand trying to force businesses out and put them in non-conforming status. It's going to impact them, but at the same time, it's been 20 years, roughly C9, and to say, wait it out another 20 to, let new developments come to bring the type of businesses and we can zone in and permit those, I think that's a challenging position for me. I am concerned about using C9 potentially, and I'm waiting to hear this, but using the zoning for Marine Drive potentially for Edgemont, because I think they're totally two different communities. I would like to find something that preserves that specialness about Queensdale, Edgemont.
So right
So those are
now,
the things that
if you
I'm
look
looking at.
the zone, oh, sorry.
Right, those are the things that I'm looking at as opposed to understanding, if we say no more this or no more that in that area, we're going to force the non-conforming. I get that, but what I would like to see is some actions on preserving that. If you look at Edgemont, yes, there's a natural turnover, there's some restaurants coming and going, that's part of business. But when potentially a medical business comes in and takes out 2 or 3 key CRUs, that's concerning to me and to some local businesses that feel like they're losing that essence of their village.
What I can say is when we look at the zones that are in Edgemont, it is much the same mix of uses. But some of those are older zones that still actually permit some of those car-oriented uses. I think where we've been lucky is that Edgemont, serving the Upper Capilano area as the kind of first place of business, if you will, for quite a large zone, has people come down and park once and walk the village and add to that vibrancy. And I think that's almost despite the zoning, you know, because the zoning, it sets the opportunity, but it doesn't limit you. If you look at the mix of uses that are permitted in Edgemont today, it includes the optometrist and the chiropractor and the insurance broker and the bank and so on. As we discussed 2 weeks ago, right? All of those businesses are currently permitted. None of them are in a situation in Edgemont where well, I don't think any of them are having to deal with grandfathered uses. I think they're all currently permitted. If we were to limit it further, then in Edgemont, 40% of them become non-conforming if we limit it to retail and restaurant only.
I would say, no one's saying can't have banks, can't have chiropractors, because my chiropractor's up there. You can't have, it's not saying we can't have them, but there has to be that balance, right? And this is the key part, without saying, I'm gonna become the curator of this space and decide who goes in. Like, I don't think that's a role of government at the same time.
Agreed.
We're gonna allow whoever's able to pay the highest rent to get in there. We run the risk of getting chains and businesses that can afford the high rent, and those little special shops may be challenging. It's tough, I get it. We don't pick winners and losers. I totally understand that. But how do we do something to make sure that the smaller businesses have a fighting chance?
And the tricky thing is when sites redevelop, even if we
That is a great
create a
point.
list of uses,
Great point.
and somehow through design guides, maybe a development coming in, other tools, you know, try to limit the retail size, because it's a new build, the price per square foot is probably not going to be conducive to some of those smaller, cute little stores that you knew from days gone by. And maybe I could lean on Adam to speak to this a little bit more, because it is a dilemma. It is something that we're very cognizant of, but zoning isn't necessarily the tool that gets things to be the way we want them to be. Luckily, as a municipality, we do have other tools, right? We think about the vision through the OCP, and by setting densities that will encourage population intensification over time, that can help. We also design the streets and set the design guidelines for the streets, and that can improve the public realm and encourage those spaces to actually be such that you can sit outside and enjoy them. There are a myriad of ways we can think about where our community centers go when they get rebuilt, so that they move to town centers, so that there's an anchor that brings you a reason to come to the town center and maybe run an errand while your kid's in a swimming lesson or things like that. So there are other pieces of this puzzle that we do have control over, but zoning, while it can help by itself, I don't think it's going to solve the things that we're hoping it can solve. And that's part of the dynamic here. But maybe this kind of brings us to the second zone. Yes.
Questions, yeah.
So this is a great discussion, although I will say, we're looking for clarifying questions in this part. We have 5 more slides until we get to sort of the first break on this section. I'd really love to get there. And at this moment, I have Yan Zhang, Councillor Muri, Councillor Back, and I think there was a pitch over to Adam on something in there. I'd love to get through the next 4 slides and then have the debate and discussion about it. But Yan Zhang, I'm going to come to you first.
Right, thank you. Sorry, thank you, Your Worship. I think first I wanted to add that there is like different neighborhoods that have their own different dynamic and different redevelopment logic.
Yeah.
And as Thompson was alluding to, that Marine Drive has a little bit of a similar to Vancouver's Kingsway, kind of that vibe, auto-oriented and then turnover, change over time, whereas Edgemont is very much a local high street. And then there's a lot of higher density uses. So there is their inherent logic, but also I want to point out that I think with our existing C zones, the various C zones, the permitted uses on the ground floor, they're very similar. It's really that additional factors that are sort of dictating what the area look like, the vibrancy of it. But hearing the conversation right now, I don't know how tonight conversation will go, but I think we can explore additional measures. Like we can look at percentage of ground floor must be limited to activating uses and things like that. We were a little bit leery of going in there because it is a little bit of a heavy tool, because, you know, we would be looking at lots of variances, lots of council decisions in that, but it is something that we can look into. Again, I'm not advocating it, but I just want to point that out. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know, Adam, did you have any comment on?
I think it's knowing where the discussion is going. I'm going to suggest that perhaps we allow Camden to cover the rest of it, because my comment would largely have to do with the discussion about preserving existing space versus, as Tamsin was alluding to, growing the pie, I guess we spoke about last, and finding that balance point. So I think that would probably be the best one.
Okay, good. Councillors Miri and back, ideally clarifying questions. Councillor Miri?
Well, you've let quite an extensive discussion occur, so I would ask for a small amount of leniency because there was a lot said. Councillor Ma had a lot, and I agree with a lot of it. I'm horrified that Marine Drive is turning into what we think is Kingsway, because it was always intentioned to be West Fourth. When we did the blanket rezoning, and it hasn't turned out that way. Blanket rezoning, you know, there was some positives to it, but there were some negatives, and now we're looking at them. You know, I agree, and I wish that there was a list. Is there a list? I'm looking at the slides, I'm looking at the report, but there's no list in regards to what the uses are underneath these zones. Like, I think that's a key piece of information that council needs to see to understand. Tamsin, you know, Yang Zen, you guys know this off the top of your heads, like you live it. But we need to see what those uses are in order to understand what you're trying to get us to decide on. There's a lot in here. I feel a bit of pressure, Mayor Little, to get this done. You know, we haven't touched this bylaw in 60 years, and I sense that we're trying to get this done before the fall, or we want to line it up with all of these other bylaws and zoning that we're trying to deal with the legislation. And I really am going to push back a little bit because there's a lot in here and we want to get it right. Marine Drive is completely different from Edgemont. Edgemont is completely different from Deep Cove. And, you know, like I was around when we did the blanket zoning on Marine Drive, and we're still waiting for some sort of vibrancy to suddenly exist because we think that's just going to manage over time. It's not. You know, the little chiropractor in Edgemont is very different from the entire block that's taken up by a business on Marine Drive. And the same, we're watching it in Lynn Creek. We're watching whole corner, you know, those 20-foot ceiling heights on the corner of a building be dedicated to a dentist. On a retail, you're never going to get vibrancy. You know, businesses that are going in there and spending that kind of money to outfit those spaces, they're not going anywhere anytime soon. They're staying. You know, if we want to look at success, you look at, you know,
True.
places like Parkgate, the older communities like Edgemont, like Queensdale, like the mall at Lynn Valley, where there are little businesses everywhere and they allow you to park your car and do errands. But on Marine
Yes.
Drive, you're never going to do that because you have to walk 4 blocks to go from the butcher to the baker. So, you know, I do think that it's about uses. I do think that there's some restrictions. We've watched it over 30 years, and we're no more vibrant than we were 30 years ago, in my opinion. I mean, luckily, Edgemont so far has been able to hang on, but there's some empty spaces up there. You know, the losing one, in my opinion, was Deep Cove. When we tried to bring in a comprehensive development zone and the council of the day wouldn't support it, and now we have a tourism draw in the Cove. You cannot buy a carton of milk in Deep Cove. And we had Parkgate, and you could still buy milk in the Cove. But we didn't look at requiring certain uses to maintain that sustainable level of a neighborhood. And here lies the problem. And I feel
Yes,
like we're just
yes, and
hoping that the
yes.
market's going to do it for us. And we're worried about square foot price. And if that's, I don't think that's our role as government either. So I think there's a lot of information that we're missing. And I think I, as a counselor, need to understand a lot better what those uses are underneath all of these zones. And I think there's a lot
Yes.
more work to do on this so we get it right.
100%.
If we assume that businesses that are pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into outfitting, multiple units that they're consolidating for their professional services, it's going to take forever, and it already has. Non-conforming, we can't force it. But I think if we looked at some uses and maybe got more of a taste from the market, and understood the community's needs a little bit more and what we want to protect. I know there was a letter that came in a while ago about why do we need a vape shop in Edgemont? It's a good question. Why do we need a vape shop in Edgemont?
Thank you. Councillor Beck.
Well, do you want clarifying questions or
Yes, I do.
comments? Okay. Because I agree with Councillor Muri's comments, I agree with Councillor Maw's comments, and I'll sort of save mine until the later part of this discussion. If we want to kind of create these vibrant town centers, which we've talked about as long as I've been on council and a decade or more before that, what tools do we have to achieve that? And I understand that there are multiple, but I do feel like our biggest tool is zoning. And I guess I'm really trying to understand the downside of if we go a little further and we restrict some of these uses. If we allow current businesses to stay in place, non-conforming, yes, but that they could be non-conforming for years, right? We're not kicking anybody out of their current locations. But what does that really mean? And what also would be the realistic timeline for these sorts of uses that we want to see in the town centers happen? If we don't start to be a little bit more strict now, that could be 10 years, 15 years. I mean, these car dealerships are still on Marine Drive. So I really want to have a better understanding of the downside, and I'm hoping that we can get into that maybe more towards the end. But what's the concrete evidence that supports restricting certain office style uses would increase vacancy in our town center? Because I've heard that brought up. What evidence is there to support that? Yeah, so those are just my initial sort of questions that will lead into my comments as we get further into it.
Would you like me to answer or keep going and then answer?
Keep going.
Keep
If
going.
it's not covered in the slides, then answer. If it's covered in the slides, then keep on going.
Okay, so the other zone that we've been talking about is a core commercial zone. And this one is one we would bring in to sites that have a higher density and more intensive use, that are mixed use in the OCP. And it would require 2 stories of commercial. And it would then give you the opportunity to move some of those uses upstairs. And I say opportunity because zoning doesn't give us any way of keeping a business in business. So if a corner store wants to close because they're retiring and no longer making money selling that jug of milk, the zoning still permits corner store, but it doesn't mean that anybody's going to go in and take that business on. And that's what we see over time is you can zone it for a restaurant, but if that site isn't ready for a restaurant, like the one on Grouse Inn, that sat vacant since it was built. It's zoned for a restaurant. It's stipulated that it has to be a restaurant, but people look at that and go, we're not quite ready for that use while the town center is under development and while you're next to the bridge and in a traffic jam zone. So it's the one right at the corner of Cap and Marine, northwest corner, is next to the bus stop. So we have this problem where we can create a zone that permits the uses that we want, but it doesn't mean we're necessarily going to get the uses that we want. And then the other problem we've seen on Marine Drive is there are restaurants there, but they've been turning their back on the street. So we do have retail and we do have restaurants. Yes, we've got perhaps too many medical health offices within a particular building, but we do have some of those uses. It's a lot about those other pieces as well. So this zone, the core commercial, does give us that chance to curate the uses, because at that point you're having an upstairs and a downstairs, or a front and a side street. And in terms of where it would apply, hold on, I've just hit the wrong button, here we go. If you think about the OCP, we have 3 mixed-use categories that would be above the basic one. We have CRMU 2.3 and 4, and those are the sites that on the OCP map are the orange and the 2 purple colors. You've seen them come in over the years. I know this OCP map is tiny to read, so we go to the next page, we can kind of zoom in. I've just highlighted those sites that have not yet come in to redevelop. So for example, the chart you saw earlier in the year, it has already rezoned, so it's not highlighted. But across the street on Capilano Road, we have a series of properties that are designated for a higher mixed use. We have 1 site remaining. Over in Latin Valley, we've got the Safeway site in the north end of the Boza Mall development. As we come over to Lynn Creek, we just have a handful of sites. That's our land. We have a couple of sites here, and we have 1 site. So the other thing you see with this map is that future OCPs may well look at expanding the number of sites that are actually mixed use. And that would increase the potential for commercial land over time. But in terms of the work we're doing today with the zoning bylaw, we are working with the existing policy, with the existing OCP. But when you look at this map, you can see that we have limited opportunities. And maybe over time, we want to expand those opportunities. And that could be part of a future OCP chunk of work. So coming to the recommendations, we would apply the general commercial to the commercial zones today. And it would continue to permit a mix of uses, and it would continue to require ground floor commercial. Probably putting in some language around that to really make sure that residential only happens on the 2nd floor and above, so tightening up that language more than what we've got today. And then we have a core commercial zone, which again would be applied as sites rezone in accordance with the OCP. We're not recommending restricting the uses by location, either upstairs or downstairs or block to block at this time, but that's absolutely something that if council so wishes, we can pursue.
Mr. Milburn.
Just to add to that, I think we've heard from a few councillors tonight, and maybe sentiment on other members of council, that there's a desire to better understand the implications of a non-conforming situation. And I think we can do some targeted engagement with our business community, because they could tell us, like, if you were non-conforming now, and you couldn't expand or relocate within your neighborhood or any other general commercial neighborhood, because that's all we have is on the ground floor, then what would that mean for your business future? What are your plans for the next 5 years? And so we can give you some feedback from the users. I think that would be very helpful for council.
And we have had some webinars with local businesses speaking to this. It's also a reason that we have Adam here tonight. Because it is something that has been raised as a concern, but we can come back with more data around that.
Adam?
If I might add, Your Worship, yeah, I think a big challenge we have here is the district already has such an incredibly low vacancy rate. There are, of course, individual instances where we see storefronts open up time sell, or maybe the business doesn't work. Obviously, post-pandemic, it's some of the financial assistance is being called
Sorry,
out.
Mayor Little. Sorry, Adam. Sorry, Mayor Little. Could you ask Adam to sit at the table? It's just hard to hear him.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We're gonna
Thank
bring
you.
up-
Thank you, Councilor Murray. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So I think to attempt to answer some of the questions that were posed with the challenge of if we were to limit and create more businesses being non-conforming, that is certainly something you can look at. General precedent we've seen from a macro level planning perspective is that can be detrimental to the overall use of space over time. Typically, when we've seen it done, obviously markets go through fluctuations, a number of things can affect what type of this work well. But we do know that the district generally right now, the reason why we see so much demand for places like doctor's offices, medical offices, dentists, etc., also services, is demographics in the neighborhood we're seeing around right now. With many people, the district tends to be wealthier, it's trending a little bit older than many other areas, and so it's a very high demand for this type of uses. And so if you were to make them non-conforming, there's likely still be very high demand for those businesses that are already in those spaces, and they wouldn't be the ones that are like given the rules that you're allowed to have for non-conforming. Another doctor's office or similar use would likely be wanting to be the first one in line to take that space if they were to close shop. So that's one thing we're looking at. The other thing is that it still would likely, there is the risk that it will put upward pressure on vacancies if they don't, because there's no guarantee that the types of business that we want will replace them. That's getting into a lot of, when you try to curate as a municipality, creating a very high administrative load on council and staff, that can be quite difficult. There are instances we have seen with specific character areas where it may be appropriate. So looking at a place like Edgemont, again, we haven't studied this, so I can't speak to the viability of it at this stage, but that has been done to limited degrees of success in some case studies. We've discussed this with staff as part of our background research a while back as a very high level discussion, but it would likely require much more review before we could make a recommendation on that path. But I think a lot of this comes back to, at the end of the day, even with the uncertainty regarding population growth in Metro Vancouver, with the way things are changing right now, it appears from everything we can see that really we need to grow the amount of commercial supply regardless of who's using it at this stage right now, because there's just so much demand across the board. And that becomes a question of how do we ensure that that space is getting built? And if you are restricting the amount of uses that can be put on the ground floor or in certain areas, then that will restrict the amount of capital that we may be willing to invest. And that may limit the potential that you have to grow that pie. So it's going to be a question of trying to find a balance point. And I think staff are asking the right questions here and trying to find the balance point. And I think that, you know, with a bit more research, talking to the business community, that this policy can potentially be refined, that can still find that investment while protecting the uses you want to see here. But we have to be careful to not be too heavy-handed, because that may sterilize development and investment opportunity for both existing businesses and the potential new businesses that may also want to join or grow already. If you have existing businesses, that's another thing I should stress, that you have many businesses, and we heard this during the EDS when we were surveying many local businesses, they couldn't find space to expand on the North Shore, and they were forced to leave. And so that's also a key factor that we want to keep in mind for many of these as well too, when we talk about restricting uses and space that's available.
The other thing that we studied as part of the background to this is what was actually happening in the successful streets. So we looked at Edgemont in particular because we wanted to get a sense of, it felt vibrant, was it actually vibrant? But we also looked at Main Street and West 4th and other streets around the Lower Mainland that feel vibrant. And when you spend time on them, you realize they actually do have those dentists still. And on Main Street, the dentist puts out a funky little sandwich board with a joke on it or something because that's the kind of street it is. But those office type uses are still happening, and yet the street is successful. So it seemed to us that you didn't need to curate the uses so much as create the opportunity for the right uses to be there. And again, grow that pie so that over time, the uses that don't need the front street can go to the side street and can go upstairs.
I've got councillors Back, Murray, and Hanson. Okay, I can go up. Councillor Murray?
Well, I think, you know, we often look at things through a single lens when we do these exercises. And I think the big difference, and I know we're going to get to this, I think the big difference is those two areas that you just talked about. Well, you talked about several, West 4th, Main Street, and Edgemont. And do you know what they all have in common that we haven't talked about, but I know we're going to talk about? And the fact, and what killed Marine Drive was we took all the parking off of the street.
Bingo!
You can park on West 4th.
Bingo!
You can park on Main Street, right in front of businesses. You can park in front of Edgemont. You know, you can't park on Marine Drive. There's no parking. And when we took the parking off, and, you know, who knows what the future holds for that street, but when we took the parking off and put those lots in the rear, it changed the entire retail focus of that street. It changed the entire sustainability of that street. Main Street in Vancouver and West 4th are some of the most eclectic business for small business and retail in the region. And it's because they left parking. You know, there's tons of little restaurants that do really, really well, tons of retail, shoe shops and dress shops. And yes, there's service shops like the chiropractor and the nail salon and the hairdresser and the barber. But it's because you can park there and you can see a whole you can find a whole bunch of services within a 2 or 3 block range and get all of your shopping done. Whereas on Marine Drive, no parking on the street, you're reduced to uh, uh, back parking lots that are supporting service-oriented business and a regional draw. Yes, you know, people are older and it's wealthier, and yes, these service providers need to exist, obviously. But you know, when you've got a dentist that has got, you know, 8 chairs, you know, for cleaning and root canals, etc., you know, that's a large number of cars that you're bringing into that area and into that parking lot, and it's competing with everything else. So I know we're going to talk about that, but I think we have to be really careful that we don't compare these areas like they're equal, because they're not. They're very, very different. They're very unique to themselves. And you cannot just apply one size that fits all in hopes that the market will look after it. You know, I get that, you know, there's a need of additional space, and that's why that second floor above the retail, you know, made sense to me a long time ago. Why we waited this long to figure it out, I don't know. It's the same as the ability for property owners to consolidate multiple units together to create a very large business, a very large profitable business at the expense of, you know, that sustainable, vibrant area. And you know, we don't pivot quick enough, and you know, I'm not afraid to put some restrictions in. You know, let's do it carefully. Let's understand what those restrictions could be. Let's understand what the uses are, so we know what deck of cards we've got, and then make some decisions from there. You know, tonight I don't have all the uses for those zones. I don't understand. You know, I just know from experience what they are. But what are the other uses that could go in there? Where could we, you know, manage some and allow others to exist? The size of the bank in Edgemont, you know, I don't think we knew that the credit union was going to expand like that. Is that what we want? Do we want large businesses like that to exist in a little tiny village? Because that's what creates unaffordability. Thank you.
Yep.
Ms. Guppy or Mr. Miller?
Just to know, we've heard that feedback from multiple councillors. We're interested in providing more information, list of uses, information from the business community, implications of the non-conforming use, and we'll take that away and we'll come back with more information for council.
Thank you. Councillors Hanson and Mott. Councillor Hanson.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to staff for all of the work and all the discussions that we've had. It's been really interesting to listen to all the different perspectives. Thank you to council for their comments. I do not support the staff recommendation that's put forward. I do not believe that we're going to be able to create the communities, commercial communities we're looking for with a one-size-fits-all approach, and with such a reluctance to become involved in curating the uses, prescribing certain uses, and well, just becoming more interventionist as we are required to do. If the proposed model is encouraging us to look at Marine Drive, then I'm not convinced. Marine Drive, in my view, is not a vibrant, to use that word, commercial area on the North Shore. So if that's where the zoning leads us, I think the argument, from my point of view, has faltered. And when I think about areas like Deep Cove, Marine Drive, Edgemont, these are all very different commercial areas. And what's required for these communities that surround these commercial areas is, in my view, on reflection, different. And I appreciate that what's before us is perhaps a painstaking exercise of looking at different areas, different commercial areas, considering what their true needs are, what will build community. But to shirk that painstaking exercise with a one-size-fits-all approach of the type put forward, I believe is not the right way to go. In the end, our duty is to try to create a livable community. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
And I think that to do that, we're going to have to do a much more neighborhood-specific analysis of where that, what would constitute that livability. I think that the fear that restricting use would lead to vacancies is overstated, and I'm a little frustrated at that contradiction in the presentation, because on the one hand, we hear that there's this terrible low vacancy rate, and this is driving the analysis. Thank you for that, Adam. And then on the other hand, we're told that if we don't pursue this liberalized approach, that we're going to have a lot of empty space. There's some conflict there in the presentation. Leaning in the direction of Councillor Murray in saying, I think we really need to start over. I think we need a lot more information in front of us about the impact of the decisions that we're going to make on the commercial areas and the neighborhoods in question. And then we need commercial areas and
Councillor Hanson, you and I do not see eye to eye all the time, but on this, we 100% do. Agreed.
There's Ma and back. Okay. I'm going to ask some clarifying questions. Okay. Two-part question, and I would think it's to Adam, but I'll leave the staff. You know, if we wait for, you know, new development to come, I'm trying to understand from a developer's perspective, so I want to clarify this. Is having, you know, more commercial requiring 2 stories of commercial uses, and commercial isn't retail, commercial is office and all that too, correct? That's my understanding. So if we require this, first question, is it more costly for them to build this? Because my understanding is, you know, when they repeat floors, you know, there's some economies of scale of building. So if we're going to have, I'm not sure if it's technically the podium, that would be 2 or 4, and then on top. Is going to this going to cause higher costs for development, which is already, as we know, squeezed right now, and, you know, there's not a lot of developments coming forward. So I would hate to put another nail in the coffin.
Yes, so absolutely. Development right now, the model in BC has gotten very good, and many other markets as well, at building called the 1+5. Commercial and ground floor, flats above. You can build a wood frame, building code allows it to be built very easily. When you do look to add additional layers, there are additional complexities that are added that are not ideal. So depending on how they have to situate the floor plate, every site is different, so I can't speak in too many generalities here, but it can create additional costs that, if not given other alternatives, if other alternatives are on the table, that developers would prefer. That said, we have seen certain policy areas, like in Surrey, for example, where they do require it, given enough density on the site, and that's the caveat, depending on how the performer works, that they will still build that to get the residential density, which is often used to offset. So it's a carrot and stick.
Great, because that's where I was leading from. You know, I get it. Developer can, you know, develop and sell, or develop and, you know, keep managing. Help me to understand. I just want to confirm this. Does the typical developer make more from residential or commercial if they manage both? Like if they still, like if it's a rental building, would they make 5 years out?
I'd have to look at the market and specific uses, but often if they do manage it, the longest time, I think, again, the Vancouver market, because condominium was so predominant, developer could come in, build the condo, sell it, get out. It was very easy. Now that condo isn't working so much, that has changed quite significantly right now. And I think you may be seeing more instances where it makes sense to have a developer run everything. That said, I don't have data in front of me right now that can speak specifically to the question in this case.
So just to clarify, there's two parts. Does it cost more to do what we're thinking about? And do they get less revenue later if they happen to, depending on how they run it? So there's a lot of nuances here, a lot of different, but I just don't want to put something in place that is going to be more costly and turn away development when we need the residential units, and then also hit them when it hurts them in terms of cash flow afterwards. So.
In response to the question, based on our past experience the last 14 years, the developers are asking for more density either way. Okay, and the second floor, it's either going to be residential or commercial, right? So it's the difference between the two. It's what the developer's thinking about, both in terms of cost and then in terms of revenue production. So honestly, if they're already asking for density, they're going to take any condition we ask for them. Offsite works improvements, amenities, anything we ask, they will ask for our density in return.
Right. And then mostly density is
including commercial opportunities but remember, there's a revenue side to the equation as well. And they do think about that, right? So it's not all cost. If you say commercial, there's a revenue potential.
Right.
But if I might just add, it's a really interesting question you ask, because while there's the potential to have the second story of commercial, or if you think about a larger site, then might say, well, we want to pool all of our commercial requirements in one medical dental building and then have the other ones be entirely residential. There may be projects like that. But as we think about future town centers and the implementation of the economic development strategy, the more you let your commercial bleed into the side streets and the rear streets, the more you can grow that pie that we've been talking about by having ground floor commercial on side and rear streets, as opposed to right now, it tends to be focused on Marine Drive or on Main Street or on Edgemont Boulevard, and less so on the side streets. So it's another way we can look at opportunities to grow that pie over time that are beyond just the zoning tool.
Second question, the district, like every municipality is unique. We all think we're special. So
we are special.
We are. I just don't want to keep saying that. Okay. So during the discussion, different members of council have talked about, Fourth Avenue. I used to live in Kitts. They talked about West Broadway. They talked about Main Street. Okay. I know that City of Vancouver has a retail continuity requirements to the point that they don't even allow medical offices. That's not considered retail. Like they have a very narrow definition because I dealt with that. I'm just wondering, how does it, I don't always want to look at other people, but how does Vancouver make it happen when they have, I believe, very restrictive requirements for retail, not just commercial, but for retail? And is that something that we could potentially apply in select markets on the North Shore? Please.
Adam, maybe you have something to add from a market perspective. I think, Councillor Ma, I think definitely that is something, what we need to keep in mind is City of Vancouver has a vast base of commercial uses, commercial floor area. And so they do have a lot of room, like their pie is a lot bigger. So they do have that luxury to actually dictate where the core commercial needs to be. So that retail continuity requirement really focus on the key streets where they do have a lot of the side street where you do see office, you see live work, and you see service type of use on the side streets, right? And this is what Tamsin's saying, that we're growing from the single corridor town center into sort of a town center kind of like a area-wide commercial area. Then we can actually then restrict the non-vibrant uses on the core street and allowing some of the office use, the service use on side streets, you see? But it is definitely something that we can explore. We're definitely, from the city's evolution perspective, we're definitely going that way.
If I can add to that, yeah, I think a big point, yes, they have the bigger pie, but the big thing too is Vancouver has a much higher population density in most areas. Not always, Fourth is a little bit lower in some areas, but even then they have, many blocks that have 3, 4-story apartments going quite a few blocks out that tend to support this. And this actually speaks to Councilor Miri's question as well too. Parking is very important in the district, given the way it has historically developed, but we are at this inflection point right now where we're starting to look at alternative forms of housing, particularly in the centers right now. And this is where we need to try and balance those commercial uses with residential density to support the growth of much needed housing and commercial space alongside here. So it's going to be, at the end of the day, a balancing act to try and support this, to get the population. This is something we heard again also through the the engagement with the business community as part of the economic development strategy, was trying to get enough foot traffic in addition to parking, to support those businesses. And those are many of the businesses that were, more experiential, restaurants, end user purchase of goods. People are willing to get in the car and drive to their dentist appointment or their doctor's appointment. Going and buying things now too, like at a store, is a little bit more challenging right now if it's not walkable, because you can just order things on Amazon right now, which is also starting to shift a bit of the balance we have for those things as well too. So this is part of the changing nature of work and business that we also have to factor into when we're talking about these policies here, is what counts as vibrant, how far people are willing to go to get it, and how closely they have to live nearby to try and balance this with other municipal objectives at the same time.
I totally understand that, our population is, 1/6 of Vancouver. At the same time, we have some very concentrated area. I look at, Mid Valley, Edgewater. It's getting there. Marine Drive, we have, a bunch of 4 and 6 plexes down there, and there's more to come. So we have those concentrations. I'm just concerned that if we build the pie out, we also kind of lose that hub that is the key. If I have to walk, as Councilor Murray said, 4 blocks, it's not a big deal. Like, I can still do it, but not everyone can walk 4 blocks or not want to walk 4 blocks. So if you spread it out such that
Who wants to walk 4 blocks in the rain, for F's sakes?
an area, it's not that, hey, I park car and I'm going to walk for 2 hours and, spend a Saturday
these
afternoon
people,
just, go out with my daughter and, having a day.
It's the same as these people that are, constantly promoting active transit and this sort of nonsense. It's absolute bullshit. We are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on the North Shore for bike lanes and bike bridges and pedestrian overpasses. I am the one that they're building at the top of the cut right now. I am desperate to see how much use that overpass gets by both pedestrians and bicycles. Because I will tell you, I drive up and down Lynn Valley Road all the time. I see bikes at best occasionally. I would suggest usually rarely, especially during the winter, which is half of the freaking year. Like, can we not have a little bit of common sense and a little bit of practicality here and understand the geography of where we live as well as the climate? Like, come on, people. Let's think just a little bit.
Still make these places with the anchors in the middle that are going to be attractive venues, locations between people living there and people driving there, because the way that the geography of the district is, people are still going to have to drive to many of these businesses at the same time too. And so it's many factors that needs to be balanced.
I appreciate that this is not push this button and we got instant community. So I appreciate that it's a complex issue, but this is where you can sense the passion among the council, but also the people that we talk to. They love this. They want to somehow grow and preserve, if that's not a paradox, but we got to find how to do that. That's the challenge. Thank you.
Councilor Back, please.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for your contributions. I found this really valuable just to get some of your thoughts as we think about this. And I share that passion with my colleagues, and I think this is a real opportunity here to try to, envision how we want our community to look and the types of businesses that we'll have create that, those town centers that we want to see. And I want to thank staff for all the work that's gotten us to this point. But while I appreciate the incremental approach that staff are recommending, I think you're hearing around the table, and I certainly agree. I'm struggling with the idea that we should wait as long as is being proposed. We've been talking about creating vibrant, and while I appreciate that convenient parking, as Councillor Miri has talked about, supports business, it's walkable town centers that we've been trying to create, being the focus. And I think, given that this is the first full zoning rewrite we've seen in 60 plus years, if we're not prepared to help shape those street level uses now, then when will we be? I think ground floor frontage in our centers is scarce and incredibly valuable. I agree with the comment that we need to go up and out, because we still need the dentists and those types of businesses, but they don't need to be on that main sort of high street. It's those businesses on that main street that set the tone for the whole pedestrian experience. And so if we continue to permit the banks and the real estate offices and these office style uses at grade, I think we're going to continue to get them. And there is a policy choice that can be made here. So I do understand the concern about creating non-conforming situations, but existing businesses can be grandfathered, as we've talked about. And I think in our key centers, demand for commercial space is strong. So I really want us to try and think further about this. When we say we want animation, the restaurants, the cafes, the small retail that extend the activity in many cases into evenings and weekends, let's really look at everything we can do with this tool being such an important tool. And if it means going town center by town center, because I agree, a blanket approach is not going to work. I'm prepared to put in that work, and I think everyone around this table is. We're passionate about our community and our neighborhoods. And those uses that compete for limited ground floor space, like let's really look at them and the types that we want to see. Because I think if we don't prioritize them, then the market will continue to prioritize the office style tenants that we've been seeing. So that's my position, and I think it's the sentiment around the table, and I'm glad that we're going to be able to go back and just see what else we can do to expand. But I really do appreciate all of the work that's gone into getting us to this point.
Thank you, Councillor Back. Some of my own comments on this. First question, just a general question. I know you alluded to this, but why are businesses choosing to face their parking lots rather than the road?
John Ranky, Step Mobility, for those that may have forgotten from last time. Generally, because that's a...
John, I'm going to ask you to come on a little closer to the table if we can. I want to make sure Councillor Miri can be in on the conversation.
You can have a seat at the big table.
I've been waiting. So the question was, why are businesses turning their back on the street?
And what I mean by that is, a lot of the cases we've seen on Marine Drive, you're now in frosted glass and not real entrances on Marine Drive, where we're supposed to have our vibrancy, because the businesses are choosing to face their parking on the back side. White Spot's one example of it, but also some of the shops that are mid-block along between Lloyd and Pemberton have done the same thing, where they're facing their parking. If it's such a bad thing, why are they all choosing to do it?
It's in some cases sort of a chicken and the egg problem, right? If you have an environment where people are choosing to drive to get to where they're going, the businesses are going to look towards where those people are coming from. It's difficult to force folks to face their visit to the street if they don't believe that their customers are coming from there. And this is a challenge that we see.
You don't need to have a degree in fucking rocket science to realize that businesses are facing where consumers are entering the business from, and consumers enter the business from where they park. Genius. It's not that difficult to figure out. And if there's no parking in front of White Spot and Marine Drive, well, guess what? There is parking behind it, and that's where they put the front door. And that's what makes it look nice, instead of having the frosted glass. Get the parking back. It's not that deep.
For their needs, they are still focusing on their parking side customers.
Yeah, to put it succinctly, yeah, I think that's the case, yeah.
The other thing I've noticed is that if you think about the White Spot, Quiznos does the same thing.
Sure.
They have at-grade parking. So it's tucked behind, but it's still there. Whereas the Greek restaurant, I've forgotten its name, but that,
Kiprapis.
yes,
My favorite.
they have underground parking, and they have And they have some at the back too, but it's more of a connection to the street. And I think it's, so one of the things we're proposing with the new zone is that the parking has to go into the parkade. And that, so it's not just around the corner. So you can't essentially drive up to the patio. You actually have to tuck your car away, come up to the street, walk along the sidewalk, and then go into the shop, or, cut through the mid-block connection. And that way
Are these people on freaking crack? You can barely build a basement, and building basements and building parkades is the most expensive thing you can possibly do. Holy shit.
So where I'm at this point is, I'm generally supportive of us consolidating most of the classes where we can, or most of the designations where we can. I have some that I'm not quite there yet. 5.3, 5.3A, or sorry, C3, C3A. So that's typically gas stations and such. I don't know that turning them into retail ground floor with housing up is necessarily the best use of those spaces. We also, the Deep Cove Village piece, that was very controversial when we brought that in. We actually had to do, I believe it was a withholding clause because we had developments that were underway at the time or potentially coming in at the time in order to be able to retain that. Otherwise, it was going to go to 4 stories throughout, which was going to be quite a dramatic change to Deep Cove. And we downsized it. My doctor still won't talk to me. So I'm not there yet on consolidating some of those uses. Most of the other uses I don't really have an issue with. C6, I don't think we should consolidate that. It's interesting to see how zoning has changed from being separating incompatible uses to curating uses. And so the original was, we did it this way because we didn't want heavy truck traffic being near office spaces and whatever. This is why we separated these uses, but it really has become a tool to select the type of businesses for that particular area. I think we still have need of a service zone that is actually not very flexible and should fit the car uses like service station, a gas station, or those kinds of purposes. Otherwise, we would have lost several of those places around our community that are very valued and used. We also, if we consolidated C6, we would lose some pubs. And if we lose C1 and C1A, which I'm sorry, C1B is left out. I think you've left C1B out, which is the neighborhood local grocery store.
have a different zone for that.
Yeah, I'm glad that's broken out. And for the exact same reason that I think some of those other ones should be still left out, because if you consolidate them all to look generally like what's been developed on Marine Drive or other places, just an example, I think we lose some important things. It doesn't mean that we don't still have some very big questions about why some of the spaces aren't working they have. So C6 is an example. BOZA made the decision to vacate the Blackberry, and it's sitting there unused with a C6 zoning. And yet everybody you talk to in Lynn Valley wants more restaurant, more pub. And here we have restaurant, pub only zoned property, and the owner has no interest in it being restaurant or pub. I don't understand how that can coexist. If you've got such demand for it, why wouldn't it work? So something I don't understand there. Anyway, at this point, I'm open to most of the consolidations. Where there is second floor commercial opportunity, I'm open to maybe 50% curated on the ground floor or something that moves some of the uses off so that we know that the entire block face isn't dominated by just destination service like dental shops and doctor's offices and whatever else. But delicate in that, I get it. It's up to the market to make sure those things survive or don't survive. And the reality is our community has money for medical and dental and aesthetic uses, which is why we have all of those services. You don't want as many nail salons in Lynn Valley? don't go to nail salons. It's eventually going to have that result, but thank you, Jim. You know, I wasn't suggesting you could use a manicure, but,
Pedicure.
they are reflective of the demands of our community. And so, anyway, it's great work. I really have enjoyed going through this. I'm going to be a little more selective about what I would support in terms of consolidating. Councillors Pope and Murray. Councillor Pope.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of your hard work on this and your enthusiasm for it. I love that. So I too am supportive of streamlining much of the zoning. I think that makes just a lot of sense, but I do think so much of the rest of it, as other councillors have alluded to and mentioned specifically, is that it does need to be more work, and that this is an opportunity to make it right. I believe we should curate the uses in certain districts for reasons that have been outlined around the table already. And I also just think that what we've been doing over the last decade or two actually isn't bringing us any vibrancy. So we really do need to be trying different things. And the basis for all of this seems to be that the predictions that we have an extreme shortage of commercial use, and it's going to get there's going to be even more demand in the coming years. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure that I fully buy that. I look around Edgemont right now, and it is just like there are so many businesses moving out, and commercials, operations on the ground floor moving in. But I think that we have to look at what we've done as a municipality. You mentioned that one of the reasons there isn't vibrancy is because, developers are sort of inhibited by municipal levies and site remediation. And actually, all I've heard since I've become a councillor, and it is nonstop and never ending, is we are the district of no. We are the district of no. We make it too hard in many, many ways for businesses to set up shop here, to open, to build.
No shit.
To do whatever. And I hear this, as I said, everywhere, in every village and every town center. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Last time this came up, I was talking about Edgemont and how we now have two parking lots. One at the grand entrance to Edgemont and another at the old site of the old Chinese restaurant. And in both those cases, developers came to the table repeatedly with proposals to do something else that would have, guess what, created vibrancy. And previous councils turned this down. We made it so difficult for them. They eventually, the owners of the Chinese restaurant sold out, and guess what? That's why we now have a parking lot. So I think we need to look at that a little more closely and do a scan of exactly why businesses have left. It's not just about not getting enough size. It's about how we do things here within the municipality that make it harder for them to develop these lands into the kind of community we're all talking about that we want. I think those are my comments.
Thank you. I've got councillors Murray and Ma.
Thanks, Mayor Little. And yeah, I concur with a lot of the comments around the table, and I'm glad we're going to send this back and look at it more. And I think what we have to do is go back to, where where we were. So if we look at our if we want to look at Lionsgate and Lynn Creek, what worked, what didn't work. I'm looking at, a street view of Capilano Road right now in Lionsgate, and we've got a health center, a couple of pharmacies, and a Fresh Slice. Is at retail grade. Is that working? We want a grocery store. I'm not convinced we're going to get one, because the decisions that were made when the developments went in were not conducive to that kind of use. Again, these decisions cannot be made in silos. They have to be made with,
Bingo.
intention of what do you want to see in a given area. I mean, I remember when the rec center was going into Lionsgate, and there wasn't even a space for a coffee shop to be implemented into that area. What I fear is what's going to happen with Lynn Valley, because right now Lynn Valley's buzzing. That mall keeps people coming into that area. But, and if you look at Lynn Creek, same thing, a little corner store. We've got a dentist, a bakery, and a coffee shop. But if the future is that we need more commercial space, I just feel like we simply process these applications, or we don't amend uses. Like we made that amendment for Denna to include a restaurant in the new tower. Why did it take the applicant to come forward and push for an amendment to put a restaurant in there? Why weren't we saying, why wasn't planning saying, you know what, we keep hearing we want vibrancy, we want vibrancy, we want vibrancy. We got to make some changes in this zoning to be able to attract that, because so far for 15 years and beyond that on Marine Drive, we're not getting vibrancy. We're getting this, we're getting locked into the highest square footage price for businesses going in, and we're afraid to see banks disappear. Northwoods is a good example. They put a bank in, it's empty. They've got, 3 employees in a fully built out CIBC full service bank that lasted a year. And the space is just sitting there, and it's used as a, very rarely do you see more than 3 or 4 people in that bank. So we've got to be more creative. We've got to be willing to take some risk. The townhouses at the capitalized Chinese that Councillor Pope's talking about, well, that applicant, that developer wanted to put townhouses on the main floor and get rid of the commercial. We're often doing this to ourselves, and not coming forward with changes when we need to make changes. And I use that gun shop and dog kennels down on Pemberton and Welsh as an example. We need to focus on our town centers, because we've lost so many opportunities that are gone. They're just gone. We've just lost them. But I think we should focus on them. I think it's hard for small business to exist because the cost of the square footage. It worries me that there are empty units up in Edgemont. It worries me that we recently had a developer come into Lynn Valley on a significant piece of property, and their original iteration of their plan was not to put commercial back in on a fully commercial piece of property. And that really worries me. That shouldn't be allowed at all. We do need to have these places. I also can't help but, the fact that businesses want to face the parking lot. I find that so interesting. It's like businesses want to face the street where the parking once was. So we make these decisions. For every action, there's a reaction, and we make these decisions, and then we wonder why what we want is not coming to fruition. It's because we're not taking action, and we need to take action in this case. And I think we do need to go back. We need to look at this again. We need to understand what uses are allowed, and we need to, as Mr. Milburn said, all applicants in town centers are actually asking for additional density. They've been doing that since the plan was adopted. It's all an amendment to the OCP. So we should be requiring that those, you know, the bottoms of those towers are split up into, and this is my question always, is the size. And how do we restrict the consolidation of multiple properties being turned into one business? Which is what's happening with these health centers and dentists and doctors. And I agree, we, of course, we need those. At Parkgate, all the services like that, second floor. The chiropractor, the dentist, the doctor's office, all on the second floor in that mall. All the main floor is all service, retail. And it's a very successful shopping center. So, you know, I don't know often why we want to reinvent the wheel. So, yeah, I'm not going to support the, you know, maybe if there's some suggestion as how we go back. I don't think I can support the motion as is. I think we still have some questions. I'd like to see what the uses are, and we need some real life examples about areas that we've already built out, opportunities that are lost, and how we pivot to make sure that we do include many of these services. And then, you know, the other issue is going to be the services that are not as attractive as the little cafes and the bakeries and the little shops, but the businesses, the dirty businesses, those commercial businesses in commercial areas like Pemberton that we need to maintain. Otherwise, we're all driving over the bridge to get things serviced. Those are the backbone of this community, and they need to maintain because those business owners live here. And we need to keep them here, and we need to focus on that as well. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. I have Councillors Ma, Forbes, and Back.
Okay, just following about Councillor Murray's comments about the light industrial area, and thank you to Mr. Milburn's team for identifying those three items. So I want to talk now just quickly about item number 2, which is the new zoning bylaw potentially restricting non-industrial use in the new light industrial zone. So this is one case where I think council should curate this.
I have a next part of the presentation on that.
Okay, so just, yeah, we have 2 more 10-minute presentations to do today.
Wow, I was so excited.
Possibly another one.
Okay, we'll save that. I had a
Oh my God, it's gonna be the longest
Question
workshop
about,
ever. I don't know like if I can stick around for all of this.
I think the presentation on the 10th said we're not looking at pre-zoning. When I talk to people from the development industry, you know, one thing they say is it takes a long time to get through processes, and as we all know, the longer a project takes, it's still more expensive. I'm just trying to understand the recommendation not to pre-zone, and to what extent not pre-zone. Is it across the board? So I just want to get a better understanding of that to clarify the situation.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this, your worship.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Zane,
so,
go ahead.
yeah, through the chair to Councillor Ma. So we are not pre-zoning because we're basically, as I said, this is more of a professional technical exercise, and we're not giving any single site additional development rights through that pre-zoning to sort of align with the OCP. And another key factor is that we do have conditions that can only be secured by rezoning, including, you know, road dedication, including offsite servicing, and those are very critical to the district. So we're not pre-zoning for that reason as well. So in terms of the concerns, and we hear that, I mean, I think one key thing to remember about the whole zoning bylaw is that instead of CD zone approach, which we have done for, you know, the past 14 years, we're actually creating standard zone that can be morphed to fit a site. So the modifier concept that Thompson presented last time, this is really just about shelf-ready zone. So that through a pre-zoning, a rezoning process that doesn't really, you know, involve individual, very labor-intensive negotiation, they can get their zoning entitlement, and then the district can get the community benefit that we want. So that is basically what the concept.
So we have ready, or on the shelf ready zoning, and we have a bunch of modifiers. Does that potentially, having the experience of developing those modifiers, is that based on the 14 years of developers coming to say, okay, over the last 14 years, developers have been asking for all these things, and here's the top 5. We're going to create modifiers for those. Is that potentially where we're going?
Well, not top 5, but
Or-
you know, a small number of things like height, for example, so that when a developer comes in, they don't have to create a unicorn zone, you know, like a unique zone, that maybe they can grab one that's sort of ready prepared, have a modifier, and place that in front of council for consideration, so that we have more standardization in the future, as opposed to just a growing depth of CD zones.
No, I would support that to give kind of like a framework so we can work with the development community, like, hey, this is what we're willing to look at. I think that's fair.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Forbes.
Thank you. I just want to add, I don't want to add to it, but I just want to reinforce that, much like Councillor Back, and I think Councillor Murray, everybody has said, I think we do need to curate. We need to show, we need to lead, because we've shown what happens when we just sit back and wait on the market to decide. So I think.
Sorry,
that's our
folks, I'll be
job
right
to
back.
do
Just
that,
gotta go
and we
to
should,
the
if it doesn't work, if
little
we
boys'
see that it's not working, then we pivot as quickly as possible. But to rule out and just let the market take a hold of it, I've lived my whole life on the North Shore, and there hasn't been that much difference on Marine Drive at all. I mean, except when Harbor Center opened up and a lot of the car dealerships went down there. But Marine Drive is not a pleasant place to go. Unless you're going, it used to be, I think it was a Future Shop that used to be in there, and a Mark's Work warehouse that was in there at one time. And unless you were going specifically to those stores, you could park right in front of the store and you would get out. But you didn't get out and walk around Marine Drive. You didn't do that. The other thing is, I like the idea of having the center streets with the main businesses. And then I like the idea of the side streets. Like I'm thinking in Lynn Valley, if the Lynn Valley Mall, behind the Lynn Valley Mall where we have residential, if we had kept going there and could have had those other services behind the mall, it might have benefited. So I really like the idea of side streets. Something else I was going to say too, I can't remember. Are we going to try and curate that, those side streets? You know, like you said, we've got some businesses go around the corner. Like in Edgemont, there's a second street that you go over to, and there's businesses along there, but they don't flourish very well there. That's always kind of in the back door, and it's not where people drive.
And it's more commercial now than retail.
Yeah. So, I mean, I could see us, you know, doing something with that back street behind as well in Edgemont. And I do agree also that all of the areas are very, very different. And you can't just put in zoning in it, and that's one size fits all, as everybody else has said. So I think we really need to go back and look at the individual town centers or villages that we're talking about, maybe get some feedback from the businesses as to why some businesses may have left or what they would like to see. But yeah, I'm afraid tonight I can't go with that recommendation. I'd like some more information and some more pointed directly to what we're talking about.
Councillor Yanzeng, please.
We will bring back those information. I think we heard a lot tonight. There's a lot of great commentary. The question about looking at side street, this is definitely the right way moving forward to the future. But there's a lot of things, like there is the policy discussion. There are, you know, we were talking about the zoning discussion. There also the market need to catch up. And so when is it in this round of zoning bylaw or in the upcoming OCP work? I think we're definitely going to look at that.
Can I just say one thing I forgot? When it comes to parking, and you mentioned going underground, the Lynn Valley Center is always very, very busy. And the parking lot is always full because we lost a lot of parking when we reconfigured and extended the patios out. The only time you'll see the parkade full, I mean, you'll go down there, you always see a few cars. The only time you'll see it full is if it's raining. Everybody is still in the habit of parking on top surface as close as they can get to the door where they're going. So I just think that's another factor that needs to be figured in there too.
All right, good. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Back.
Just wanted to make a quick anecdotal, tell a quick story, because I heard the comment that the district hasn't always been known as a business-friendly community, and I want to say, I think that's changing. And I want to give credit to Neonila Lilova and our economic development manager, because I'm hearing lots of good feedback from the community. But I remember a number of years ago, I found myself after a council meeting one night, it may have been at a local establishment, and I was sitting beside somebody, and he said, "Yeah, we're two fellows, and he said, we're looking to open a new brewery." I'm like, "Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, it's going to be called Shakedown." I'm like, "Oh, that's fantastic. That was one time what Lynn Valley was called." "Yeah, we're going to open in the city of North Van." I said, "Well, what do you mean? Like that should be in Lynn Valley." Well, yeah, we want it to be in the district, and I won't go into any of the specifics, but they said the reception that they got from the city of North Van was so different from what they received from the district. It was like every conversation they had with district staff, it was kind of leading to no, versus quite the opposite in the city. So I think we've come a ways. That was a number of years ago now, but just want to point out that it's not just necessarily a tool like zoning, it's your whole attitude around supporting business. And I'm glad that we're making some headway in that department.
Okay, Councillor Murray.
I don't have anything to say. Well, actually I do. I see we're running out of time and we're not going to get to that parking discussion, and I feel bad for our presenter. If we are we going to continue, Mayor Little, or
We don't have another meeting to go to after this, so we're wide open.
Okay.
On your team.
I'm wide open to.
Okay,
Lisa
so
looks
I'm
so
gonna go on
happy
to the
about
next
that.
presentation then, if that's okay. All right. Part 2 of part 2.
Thank you. Okay, so hopefully this one, we did a better job of listening. So I want to take you through what we heard about in terms of the industrial zones, what the actions are, what's coming next, and have maps for each of them. And again, this should be fairly quick. So we talked briefly last time about the heavy port industrial zone and how we're really not changing it much at all because it has been working very well. With the main change being for subdivision, just making sure there's less opportunity to divide up those large lots. And then this is the map showing where those sites are, and they're pretty much as you would expect. And the heavy port industrial lands are for the most part south of the railway tracks. That helps people kind of visualize them a little bit, and of course, next to the ocean. So then we turn to the light industrial, and again, we had this kind of task of how do we expand the pie, but also continue to protect those lands that have historically been that land that supports the heavy industry and supports the community, but with a kind of light industrial flavor. And so what we heard loud and clear from you was there was a need to push back and to further protect those lands. So we'd already been discussing this quite intensively and looking at the different uses. So we knew what the problem uses were. And we talked a little bit about childcare last time, but there are two other groups and they kind of have overlapping definitions, and they relate to those kind of instructional services, childcare programming, and fitness. And then sometimes overlapping, you know, a dance studio or a martial arts studio, maybe just as much as where you send your kids after school as it is for adults, but it is that overlapping piece. Fitness in particular seems to be the growing category where we have 17 businesses in the Pemberton Welsh area. And so if we were to restrict these three uses, we would further protect the more traditional light industrial uses. And then if I could just build on that, we currently permit automotive services. We could restrict that a little bit so we continue to focus on the service aspect, the way you get your car repaired, but no longer permit the auto sales. And while most of the auto sales are non-conforming on Marine Drive in a commercial zone, we're also talking about bringing that non-conformity into the light industrial. So businesses like Auto Depot don't expand through our light industrial lands. And we do have a fairly tight restriction on retail currently, but we would further restrict that. It would continue to be an accessory use. So for example, if you're installing flooring, you can also buy flooring. If you're an upholsterer, you can also buy the furniture they supply, but definitely ratcheting back on the size, so it's more geared to the businesses that we have, and we don't encourage large retail businesses to come in. Thanks. And then lastly, using the same logic, we don't have any large restaurants in our light industrial. We haven't seen this use class grow much, but this is kind of a preventative measure to say, you know, especially as Marine Drive and the lower Northgate area builds out, we will probably get more pressure on Pemberton. So if we put this in now, it helps say, yeah, it's fair to have a couple of businesses that support the local workers, but that they're limited to the kinds of businesses we currently have that are just that, you know, lunch counters, the taco shell, the taco place, small kind of intimate spaces, and not the much larger spaces. So again, the conclusion for light industrial would that, and sorry, I can look at the screen, I always forget what you think by now, that we are keeping the focus on the light manufacturing, contracting, and repair type uses, and then tightening or restricting the uses related to childcare, fitness, retail, restaurant. And again, where are these zones applied? Light industrial, primarily the Welsh Pemberton, and there's another pocket over in Maplewood on Charles Street and a little bit of Riverside. And then the other random little pieces are the hydro substations. And if I zoom in, these are the two primary areas. Business park, now this is the phase 2 work. We know we have some fairly successful business park sites in Maplewood. They are zoned comprehensive development today. And interestingly, they're not all zoned the same zone. So what you can do in one is different to what you can do in the neighboring and so on. So going forward, we would like to come back and look at them as part of a deeper dive piece of work that will bring forward a business park zone that is one zone for the handful of sites that are there, but also working with people like Adam and the business community, looking at how we can encourage further intensification of those sites, potentially through taller buildings and so on. So that's a piece of work to come. And again, that's where, you know, that's those areas along Darlington Highway, between Darlington and Spicer, and south of the Stones development we were talking about earlier. The last piece we talked about last time was, again, learning from other potential more intensive development that we're seeing in places like Vancouver, and starting to think about where that could be applied. And that definitely is a piece of policy work and a deeper study piece that would come after more intense work. But it's the kind of thing that means that we would not be bringing in the light industrial zone to two key areas. For those of you who know the OCP, you'll know the area around Canadian Tire has a designation of commercial. It's only commercial, it's not a mixed use. So we wouldn't be applying the mixed use zones we were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only a 1 FSR, and yet it's on rapid transit in a town center. It feels like it's a little bit under its highest and best use. So as part of a more deeper dive into policy and looking at the economic development impacts, instead of bringing in a zone that's not quite right now, we'd like to keep those that area.
I'm curious, is there any concerns of flooding along that area?
Some of these sites
I don't know.
might
I mean, it's not a
be
bad point,
suitable
to be
for
honest.
more intense development. Same issue with Maplewood. We have a small pocket of what we once called light light industrial artisan, which was a strange mix of industry and residential. And we know that once we bring it in residential, we will never get that commercial potential back. So again, we'd like to wrap that into that deeper dive on how we can intensify our commercial uses in these business settings inside our town centers. So we wouldn't be bringing in the light industrial zoning here, no matter how innovative we make it, because we want to see whether we can actually do more with those sites in the coming months as we do a deeper dive on that. So really, the main recommendation we're making tonight is that the light industrial zone would be amended as discussed at our last session to restrict some of those commercial uses that are currently permitted and focus more heavily on the traditional light industrial manufacturing, auto-oriented contracting uses that we want to protect in a light industrial area. Okay. Oh, I didn't have a question slide, so we'll stay there.
Yeah, I had a question about that. So, sorry, the CD zones that you've identified generally are working very well. And so why do we want to change them? I heard you say, particularly for the one that's not part of this study, the Canadian Tire complex down there, you identified that one. It's one of our busiest retail spaces. And so I don't feel like it's an underuse of the space. It's packed on a Saturday. And so how are we drawing the conclusion that it's really underutilized?
Mayor Little, what area are you talking about again? Sorry, what area?
Well, I'm actually breaking the rules. I'm talking of something that was very specifically excluded from this study, but I will just say, so I won't carry on with it. I'll just say it's the Canadian Tire property. When we have that future discussion about it, I got to tell you, it's working extremely well. It is one of the most popular spaces that Canadian Tire and Michael's and the Tim Hortons and McDonald's, those are. So I don't know why we put our target on the places that are working well. Same thing for the CD zones in Maplewood as well. They're working well under the CD zoning, and so what's the value add to compressing it into a business park, new zoning across the other? That's just a general comment on it. I'm fine generally with better controls over what can go into light industrial, but I mean, you know that council's had some debates as of late about the changing definitions of some of the uses and how it affects light industrial zones. And so I guess my question would be, one of the questions from council was, how do we deal with office use even as a secondary accessory in light industrial spaces? How do you see that being used going forward? And would you contemplate further reductions in the accessory uses on those spaces? So specifically, our discussion was about accounting offices, lawyers' offices, those kinds of things in those spaces.
Yeah. So the existing zone, there are two existing light industrial zones. One permits certain types of offices, the professionals, which were the surveyors and so on. And the other permits office, but only on the upstairs. So it doesn't divide out the type of office. It just says, if you're an office, if you're that kind of commercial use, you move to the second floor. So going forward, the upper floor remains somewhere, and if I go back to this, let's go back to this slide here. In this light industrial zone, we can be more permissive with that upstairs if we so wish. The general notion is, and we found this over the years, that the most critical space that you need to protect for light industrial uses is that ground floor, so that you can drive the car in to be repaired, you can have the loading bay right there. We have explored in the EZLI zone a 4-story, fairly high density to cut with more commercial uses upstairs to see if it could trigger redevelopment. we didn't have much success with that, but what we did see was a little bit of erosion of some of the light industrial happening on the ground floor. So recognizing that, we're kind of looking at what the problem, which seems to be more the fitness than the office, which I think because we had that upstairs limit, which we would keep.
Yeah, is that-
Yeah, and to add to Thompson's point, I think at this juncture with this zoning bylaw, we're not going to change any of those percentage restrictions or office use as accessory use. But she also pointed out that we do need to look at those uses in our light industrial zones, and that's a phase 2 work. And I think there is a demand for office space just going to those industrial area, and then sometime it may be okay if it's more intensified use, not replacing some of the existing uses that are there. So it is use that, it is a work that's going to be following to implement the economic development strategy. And it's not going to be following into the future, like 2 years from now, but very soon, I think. So that will answer that question is what is the industrial use trend? What is the office location trend? Should they be focusing more on the town center? And then we're talking about growing that pie. Some of the sites probably should be developed to accommodate more office type of use. And parking is also part of that. So future work.
Councillors Ma and Mary. Councillor Ma.
Thank you. Going through this, no question about the heavy industrial zone. Totally agree with the light industrial zone. We do need to protect it. And I will give my opinion. We don't need housing in every single zone. We've given up some light industrial land previously for housing, and I think they're incompatible uses. I think we need to protect it. We need to protect our employment lands. We talked about limiting restaurants to 5,000 square feet. Are there any non-conforming restaurants right now in that area? Would we put them in the same situation if we pass kind of like restrictions that they now become non-conforming? We have all the challenges with non-conforming business.
No, because and this is an option, of course, but at this point, what we were proposing to do was continue to permit restaurants. So they wouldn't be a non-conforming use, but limit their maximum size. And the size actually, most of the restaurants we've got, or in fact, all of the restaurants we've got in the Pemberton Welsh Strip are quite small, so they work with this. But it was to prevent a large, somebody help me with an example of a large restaurant, but one of those chain ones coming in and going, oh, this is just around the corner from our town center and cheaper, let's buy this up. So it's a preventative measure than restrictive, if that makes sense.
I'm looking at the business parks, more permissive. Is that also to allow for a retail element? I think of some businesses down there, like Arteric, warehouse and stuff like that. So is that going to be allowed to continue?
Most of the retail you see there is actually related as an accessory component, right? Because Arteric's had their research and development site, and then they had a store on the end site. But there is also a larger component of fitness and children programming, right? You've got laser tag there, you've got the Hive, you've got, a variety of those uses that are more commercial in nature, shall we say. So what seems to be working with the business park is it keeps some of the light industrial components, more so on some sites than others, but allows more of a mix. So you even have things like a dentist upstairs, you've got the crab shack, you still have that kind of mix of commercial elements.
When I think of some other municipalities, there's certain areas that are kind of like the medical area, a lot of appointments. Is that something that's contemplated potentially?
It's a really interesting question, and it's one we've come back to periodically over the years, because a couple good medical dental buildings could really help us.
Exactly.
And I think it's reason why Neonilla wants us to do this deeper dive on some of these sites, because if there are some sites that would be suitable for a multi-story building, you could start to cluster some of those uses And because they often like to cluster, you have a lab on one floor, a pharmacy in the bottom, suddenly it becomes the ideal place for some of those medical offices, and they no longer want to be on that main street, right? So it's about growing that pie and trying to find the right sites and trying to figure that out in a way that works with our market, given that we have a lot of small lots that aren't conducive to redevelopment, and we have a lot of sites that we really want housing on, or that we want commercial uses on. So we have to figure out where is that right spot. And I didn't mean to suggest Canadian Tire isn't very viable. It's more that if you look at that neighborhood, there's a lot of one story in a town center where, I mean, let's face it, the Canadian Tire that my daughter uses in Vancouver is part of a much bigger complex with Home Depot as well, right? There are different ways of thinking about how we build some of these sites. And as we look ahead, there may be some ways to intensify use in some key zones or spots. But I think it does require a deeper dive than just a refresh to zoning, where we're trying to match what's on the ground today.
Because if I think of our friends in the city, right away I think of two areas where there's Westview and parts of Lonsdale. That's where a lot of the medical offices are.
Yeah.
Not, although you got the big dentist office that took over the two lines, which is awful. Thank you. Okay.
Just wanted to reiterate staff's comments that we're looking at some translation and then some very targeted interventions.
Graves are when you kill a whole bunch of people, take bulldozer, and you bury them.
I think council's very interested in discussing those future conversations.
But it's like
We want to get there, but we're suggesting that if we're going to have a conversation in the next few months, we'll probably need to put those things just in the parking lot for a short amount of time and then come back to them, because they do require that in-depth study, and I think we're here now.
Right. Totally, I appreciate that. At the same time, as Council mentioned, if we had those, it would alleviate some of the, I believe, some of the other challenges that we're facing. So which one do you put first, right? So I hear you, but I'm very, in terms of this second recommendation, I am supportive. And like, if I would put in a nutshell, put certain things in certain places.
Yeah.
Right, maybe. Yeah. Thank you.
Can I just clarify something that came up in there? So about the clustering, we'll say, of medical uses and such. I think the only medical-only office building in the district of North Vancouver is the one we own in Lynn Valley, right?
Yeah, we don't have medical dental buildings here, but we've always been curious about it because, even 20 years ago when we were starting to look at the OCP process and 15 years ago when we were looking at the local plan for Lionsgate.
While I may or may not agree with this woman on the regular, you gotta love her passion for what she does. I have so much respect for that.
They were building out this little town center and had managed to get a developer go ahead with a 6-story medical dental building, and it filled up. It was a case of they built it and they came. So it's always been something on the periphery of, could it work here? But we haven't seen any appetite for it in recent years. So it's something that we need to do a deeper dive on, but.
It's an Adam or John question, but why? Right? What is it about the market that doesn't want to consolidate these uses, or sees it as too risky when you're venturing out and building an office building?
It's a challenge right now. Just generally the time to lease up is seen as it's not like condo where again they can sell it, get the wash their hands off. Even, I think, are you thinking of the Port Moody one that you're talking about?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the developer on that one had to take up a couple floors for a couple of years in my dentist office in that one. So like, it's successful now, but it took some time. And that's usually the biggest question to recover the capital investment. Takes longer than alternatives. Again, market's kind of changing right now. So that if you went back and did the analysis again, it might be more favorable than what it had been. Other thing is just speculation. If they can build residential and they can potentially get away with it, if council is willing to consider it in a lot of those mixed use areas, then they might just be willing to hold out and sit on an asset that's cash flow positive for many more years until they could come back to something more valuable.
Paying $50, $55 a square foot for retail frontage why wouldn't that be of interest to somebody to stack them in a building? But okay, it's got some risk to it. Okay, Councillors Murray and Hanson. Councillor Murray, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor Little. I'm supportive of the heavy industrial zone. Although you know, I'll leave it at that. I think maybe there's benefit in you know, talking about the EZI zone and what these zones, just like the commercial and the residential zones, mean. What do they allow? So I think, you know, educating all of us, because we don't talk about all of this all the time, and understanding it a lot more. I think we need to have an inventory of the light industrial that we have lost. Because when the OCP was created and adopted, its policy statement was protect light industrial. And we didn't do that. We rezoned a lot of light industrial at a time when we thought the Maplewood lands on Dollarton, that's owned by the federal government, would be the future catch-all for industrial. And obviously that did not materialize. And now we have, you know, very little control, if any, over that land, given that it is the addition to reserve for the Tsleil-Waututh. But I think we need to understand where we were and where we are now in relatively a quite short period of time, 15 years since that OCP was adopted. So I think an inventory of how we have changed land use, primarily for residential use in the district, and see where we end up. I also think it's important to understand what our neighbors are doing, what the city is doing, and what West Van is, but particularly the city. You talk about office and medical buildings. Well, there's lots of medical buildings still in the city of North Vancouver. 13th and Lonsdale is a prime example that we all are aware of. And the idea that, you know, we need to look at this office component, and everything I'm hearing from the commercial realtors that I talk to are saying the exact opposite. Office is not trending. It is not a trend. I mean, there's empty offices by the hundreds downtown. So I don't know why we think we need to be curious about that and look at those kinds of opportunities. You know, we look at ourselves as a, you know, a silo sometimes, where, you know, the North Shore, we talk about the support, you know, supporting amalgamation. You know, would it not make more sense for the North Shore to be one municipality instead of three?
Yes,
How
it
would we look at
fucking
this
would.
differently if we were one? Let's just think of ourselves as one. What does the city offer that we don't? What do we offer that the city doesn't have, and West Van?
Not much.
You know, how do we complement each other? Why do we want to, you know,
Yes.
repeat what our neighbors are doing?
Amalgamation.
Why don't we,
yes.
You know, we'll look after some things, you look
Yes.
after
Yes.
others.
Yes.
And I think we need to take that sort of more broad view of as we move forward, because I don't think we're helping ourselves necessarily. At all costs.
Amen, sister.
At all costs, we need to protect light industrial land going forward. And I agree with Councillor Ma. We do not need to put housing in every single quadrant of this municipality. This municipality was built on blue collar workers and light industrial and heavy industrial businesses. You know, the curating and protecting light industrial, at all costs, we need to do that. And to keep those dirty businesses that pay the bills, that allow people to live in this community because they are successful. You know, Headwater and Edgewater and Tupper and those businesses, you know, the ones that you've put up as far as the auto repair shops, North Shore Off-Road, you know, those companies, those people live here. They make good money. They have good businesses. They are successful entrepreneurs. And we need to protect them at all costs and help them remain here, because they work for us. They work for this municipality. They work for the other municipalities. They work for the taxpayers and neighboring businesses. So, you know, those are the businesses that are like the heavy industrial businesses. Those ones are actually the people that are able to stay in this community, and they've had successful businesses and growing businesses for years. You know, we talk about Canadian Tire. I remember when Canadian Tire was zoned, and it was all good jobs, well-paying jobs, just like Hunter Street, the development that we put in on Hunter and Mountain Highway. Those were $50 an hour jobs, light industrial commercial businesses, and we rezoned them and replaced them with, you know, minimum wage jobs for the most part in retail sector. There was a huge public
Interesting
outcry
point.
about that Canadian Tire development. You know, we've come to, you know, as Mayor Little, it's a successful business. Lots of people go there, but it's at the cost of other little businesses disappearing. You know, like my dad's hardware store in the Cove, and Windsor Plywood up in Lynn Valley. That was a
Yep.
big loss for that community.
Huge loss.
You know, now we're going to those big box stores that we have prohibited in the past. So I do think we need to see where we were and what we've given up. Probably in all areas. We're rezoning parkland. We're rezoning light industrial land for housing. It's all about housing. And you know, a sustainable community needs all of those legs of that stool, that three-legged stool, to exist. And we have to be very cautious as we move forward. And I think we really need to talk to those businesses too, not just to, you know, making decisions based on trends or what we think we should include. We need to talk to those businesses. We need to talk to those commercial realtors that are on the ground working every day and have been in this community for decades, and ask them what they're seeing. Because what I'm hearing in this presentation in regards to that office and what I'm hearing from those people that work in this community is something different. The last thing I'll say is the pending future study site, and this has always been my fear. Crown and Main, that commercial side down by our works yard, what are we gonna do there? And I mean, I think we really want to understand what kind of community we are and who we are. Because we have been able to remain relatively sustainable because we do have businesses like that. And I think we have a bit of an identity crisis. We've been wanting to grow up into a big city for a long time, and we're just not. We're a suburb with commercial and retail areas scattered throughout our geography, and it works well. We're all different. You know, and the inching and the building up, the densifying of Lower Lynn, for instance, is putting more pressure on those commercial areas that are critical to how we exist. When the businesses down on Welsh Street, when BC Rail was there, and there was threats of change down there, I know for the heavy industrial users, it was a huge impact to them because a lot of those businesses supported the heavy industrial uses. And as those disappear, that sustainability and that ability to keep people that actually live and work here is eroding. And it's the exact opposite of what we're always trying to do. We're trying to keep people that work here, living here. And we've got that in this light industrial commercial sector where people can run businesses and afford to live here. And so we have to protect them at all costs. So I think there has to be a lot of discussion. There has to be a lot of, you know, I'd like to have a forum where we invite, you know, local professionals in, ones that deal with the market on a daily basis in this area, and those businesses, and ask them what they need, how we can support them. But council needs to hear that too. We need to, and I say this to you, Mr. Fox, that, you know, we've been saying for a number of years that we want to get back to those town halls. We want to get back to meeting people in a room rather than on a Zoom call. I'm sick. That's why I'm on Zoom today. I don't want to get anybody else sick. But we need to have that face to face with people and have discussions with them. And we've lost a lot of that over the years. And I think it's important for the community, the business community, our residents, and ourselves, so we can really understand what we're doing instead of, you know, I mean this with great respect, Tamsin, instead of being curious. I love your curiosity and I love that you are so excited about this. But we have to be careful of these decisions that we make going forward. So I'm glad we're taking a very cautious approach with this. But you know, it's got to be based on real hard data and the inventory that we've lost in regards to light industrial, because we've lost a significant amount, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got Councillors Hanson and Beck. Councillor Hanson.
Thank you very much. I can keep my comments brief. I do support the staff recommendation. I support the efforts to protect light industrial land. I echo the comments that have been made about the loss of light industrial to housing, and that in some cases, in my view, has been a mistake within the district. I believe that the proposed restrictions that have been put forward with respect to childcare and fitness are reasonable with the light industrial zones. With respect to the accessory uses, the restaurants, the retail, again, I do support the recommendations. I just observe that we have to be careful to ensure that those accessory uses, however they develop, don't undermine the capacity of the space to support light industrial uses. And saying again, I do believe it's a key priority that we protect what remains of light industrial within the district. As to the other study areas, I'll leave discussion of that too.
Thank you, Councillor Hanson. Councillor Beck, please.
Thank you very much. I will keep my comments fairly brief as well. I support the heavy industrial zone. I'm very aware of the threat that light industrial, the pressure that light industrial land is under. I know it's some of the hardest to replace once it's lost. Last term I served on Metro Vancouver's Industrial Land Strategy Task Force. So I learned a lot being part of that. And so, you know, as much as I want to protect it, I also want to see if we can incentivize the intensification of industrial where it makes sense. Because I know the look of light industrial is going to evolve and change because there's only so much land. And so I want to make sure that we are, you know, I know that was a big part of the strategy, the Metro Vancouver Industrial Land Strategy. So looking at how we can help promote that where it makes sense. But absolutely, I wholeheartedly support the protection of light industrial land. As has been pointed out, there's a lot of jobs that come out of that relatively small amount of land, local jobs, good jobs that we need in our community and services that we need in our community. So I certainly want to support protecting them, but I also support the way we're kind of looking to evolve it and restricting some of the uses. So I also, in terms of the next phase 2 work, I support that as well. So lots of good stuff in here, and happy to support it.
Thank you, Councillor Beck. Councillor Pope.
Thank you. Yes, of course, we need to protect light industrial. I don't know why I'm hearing so many negative comments about housing, because so many other cities in the world are doing light industrial mixes with residential housing, where the residential goes on top of the light industrial. And I have no problem with that. I think that that would make for the vibrant kinds of communities that we seek. I'm thinking of, you know, Vancouver in particular has done so much work in this area, and I'm wondering if this kind of zoning was applied, light industrial zoning, like would we be able to attract the bigger employers like tech, universities, or you know, electronic arts, healthcare, that kind of thing? Would that pave the way for those kinds of employers to be here?
A few different pieces there.
Yeah.
So within the light industrial zone, we're really trying to keep it around the kind of service-oriented traditional uses, you know, like the auto repair, the contractor, and the light manufacturing. It does permit research and development, but when you look at where we would apply the light industrial zone, probably have on the map here, the these areas are a whole variety of very small parcels. So getting them to redevelop to really bring in a key large employer is quite tricky because so few of them are large enough to redevelop together. Now, that doesn't mean consolidation is impossible, and it's why when I talk about future study, I flagged that we do have a couple of sites that are quite large. The one that used to be our COVID center, if you remember, down in the just off of Pemberton.
The old ICBC.
Yeah, the old ICBC, yeah.
A lot of eyes on that property.
Yeah, and I have no idea what the province is thinking about for it, but there are a couple of sites like that that have enough of a land base that they might be of interest for that more intensive development. But again, we want to be very careful about eroding our light industrial because industry can't go anywhere else. Offices could go in a more intensive area of a commercial neighborhood, but industry really stays in industrial areas. So it's why looking ahead beyond just the application of light industrial, as we think about business park and as we think about other sites that might be conducive, I think we need a deeper dive on that. We want policy folks at the table. We want people like Adam really looking at what would be the best attractor. And I'm going to leave that there. Maybe have you jump in if there's anything you want to add.
Through your workshop, I think you covered honestly most of it. The big thing for industrial, and having worked on the industrial land strategy, there is so little of it left. And yes, we've seen some very interesting examples where other uses have been integrated in, especially in the Vancouver context. Yellowtown was industrial one time, but it's not industrial anymore. If you go down there, and many of those areas where they have allowed residential or other uses, they've attracted investment, but they've also attracted a ton of speculation, which if we're talking about protecting the auto repair shops and those blue collar jobs in the small, the industrial that you have there right now, in my experience and case studies I've looked at, almost every single time, that's the death knell of those jobs if you start talking about allowing those kinds of uses, because it becomes a very thin edge of the wedge. And we talk about speculation for office uses and residential. Residential and industrial, not only does it start to create a whole bunch of attention that wouldn't have otherwise been there, it limits the industrial investment that you might otherwise see there. And as we talked about, kind of a core reason for zoning back in the day was to prohibit uses that didn't work together. And there are some cases where light industrial and residential can work together, but a lot of businesses can find conflict regardless of how much mitigation that the municipality requires there. And so it's generally not a recommendation, especially if we're talking about broad zoning as we are at this level right now. There may be case-specific examples where we're talking about trying to attract a larger employer with a key site, and we would need a lot of research looking into who would be potentially investing in that, what they'd be looking for, transit access, site profile, everything like that. So that's a very specific question we want to dig into with more research, as Councilor mentioned.
Yeah, because if I could continue on that, I remember talking to an employer a couple of years ago who actually was a high tech, and they needed a big space and they could not find it in the district. So when you say, offices and things like that, I think you're referring to tech offices, which are offices. Like you said, well, they could just go to a commercial zone, but where would that be?
Well, and I think that comes kind of full circle to Councillor Ma's comment about medical dental. It could also be a tech building. It's really thinking about not just our light industrial and our business park, but also our commercial areas a little bit differently. And scratching the surface on what could work in different areas. And so it wasn't that I wanted to pick on any particular site with what the future could be with this, but it was more just recognizing that we've got some sites that are in town centers, close to transit, may have the size that makes this worth thinking about. But this really is something where we need to dig a little deeper and do it in the context of the other policy issues that we're balancing. Recognizing that we need the light industrial jobs, we need the commercial, and we still need that housing, right? It is that balance. And then one last point, a few years ago when we were first thinking about the ECLI zone, the employment zone light industrial, we explored having it be 3 or 4 stories of commercial use. So you have a ground floor of light industrial, then commercial uses, and then the very top floor would be a kind of cherry for if you built the rest, you would get housing. And we didn't go for it in the end, but it was something that we did start to get interest on. So it would be interesting to maybe explore that again to see whether it is a problem, because we were a bit wary of
Yeah.
that, the friction between the uses.
Yeah, but it's being done so much is my point. Like, if you look at False Creek Flats in Vancouver, that's what they're doing there. They're also doing it there's examples of it already in South Vancouver.
Yeah,
You
and so
know,
I think
down in that whole
it really
industrial.
merits kind of digging a little deeper into what makes it attractive and what makes it work and what are the problems that have happened and whether any of those things are translatable to our
Muriel.
Well, I was just going to say one of the things that we're leaving out in this is the value of land when you change uses. And childcare. My understanding is that childcare on main retail properties have actually increased the assessments. So that is increasing the cost to the property owner. The same when you look at mixed use and commercial, the assessments will go up. And then those long-term tenants or owners, they see those increased costs. And I agree with the mayor that I don't trust the provincial government and have concerns about, if they've, and based on this recent budget that's been presented, they haven't done the math on a lot of the changes that they've made and how that's going to impact, what these values are. When we blanket zoned Marine Drive, the Tomahawk, their assessment went up by 450%, I think it was, Mayor Little. We had to, take a significant position and work with that restaurant to be able to keep it here because they were making their living off of selling pancakes and coffees and chocolate milk. They ran no bar, they had no liquor license, and we did some quick work to make sure that their operation could remain, and that was 20 years ago. So there's always unintended consequences to a lot of these changes, and more often than not, that we don't necessarily get those fine details and talk about that whole encapsulated list of issues that rise up when you make some of these decisions. So I think that has to be part of the discussion going forward, so we understand it. You know, when I said that we needed an inventory of the loss of the light industrial and how much, green belt that that we're rezoning or losing, I would also ask for an inventory on, and I know it's challenging, but to find out what our nations, our neighboring nations are looking at. We know that Tupper has been given a 3 months notice on the property that he's using off the Dollarton. Again, a business that is an important part of this community and supports this municipality and other municipalities and other businesses, and takes a lot of the heavy loads off of driving product and fill across the bridge. But we talk about that need of housing, but what are the First Nations looking at in the next 20 years in regards to housing? What is coming to that land on the Dollarton? We know that when Darwin approached us with the idea of the Innovation District, the provincial government under the Ministry of Highways said that if it went forward and it was a tech concept with, everything but the kitchen sink included, the provincial government stated that the road network would fail because we don't have the infrastructure to support something like that. So, there's so many details that go into, all of these discussions, and it's not just about a use, but it's the value and the infrastructure required to support it. And what's going on around it. And all of those things need to be considered as we move forward. So, I think there's a lot of discussion that needs to be had about this very important, use in our community. And, we talk
Yep.
sometimes about, what West Van doesn't have. The city and the district have industrial and light industrial land. And we're lucky that we get that taxation from those uses. We're very, very lucky because Allied will tell you, they use very few services, for the amount of tax they pay. But West Van only has retail and residential, and often it's not enough. So, I think we need to understand the big picture as we move forward, and talk to a lot of different groups and businesses and professionals in the business to truly understand our market, because it's a unique one. Our geography creates a unique access issues for businesses, the cost of land, the rise in assessment value, all of those things contribute to why people make decisions whether to live here or do business here. And I think we have to look at all of those things as we move forward. Thank you.
Councillor Murray, we've had a really good go at this. I think it's probably time to go into the third presentation.
I will switch places. Do you want to stay there? You can just.
Oh, geez.
The arrow key is the easiest.
Well, thanks everyone. It's great to be here.
Last but not least.
Glad everyone's still here. So the next thing we're going to talk about a little bit is parking and mobility, often just referred to as the parking section of the zoning bylaw. One of the things we're trying to do here is really take a holistic approach to all the different mobility needs that people have. Really, this section of the bylaw is regulating how people move between the street and buildings. Much of the time that's in cars. That's where we spend most of our time talking in the zoning bylaw. It's probably what we'll talk about most tonight as well. But we're also thinking about things like goods loading, passenger loading, bicycle parking, and measures around accessibility and design that make these spaces work well. So that's just something I wanted to talk about sort of at the start, just so we can sort of frame up the conversation a little bit. To start off this process, one of the things we did was look through the existing zoning bylaw sections, try to understand where are the opportunities that we can look for change here to make improvements. One of the big things that stood out was adding new land uses, realigning some of the categories of land uses so that they are the same as the new zones that are being created. We wanted to incorporate some of the external policies that right now live outside of the zoning bylaw, alternative parking rights policy, bicycle parking policy, EV charging policies, things like that. Make sure that those are in the zoning bylaw where they are much easier to reference. We also wanted to respond to some of the changes that are happening within the district around transit, around growth. Right now, the zoning bylaw treats parking across the district the same way, but there's a case to be made for making changes around growth areas, not just in TOAs, but in other areas of growth as well. Again, I already mentioned goods loading, passenger loading. That's something that right now is not very present within the zoning bylaw, so we want to strengthen that. And then finally, looking to improve clarity and consistency throughout the document. So that's at a high level what we're trying to accomplish. We'll get into a little bit of detail on each of those things today. One of the important things we think about, though, when we're talking about parking requirements is this concept of right-sizing requirements. There's no one correct number when it comes to parking requirements. There are simply trade-offs. And if you have requirements that are too low, you're going to have one set of problems. Alternatively, if you make those requirements too high, you're going to have a different set of problems. And fundamentally, what it comes down to is a balance of values and a balance of what you want to achieve with development, what you want to achieve with buildings, and the kind of the buildings that you want to see within the district. If requirements are too low, the obvious outcomes are increased congestion for parking, reduced ability for folks to access businesses, potential impacts on the viability of those businesses. But if those requirements are too high, and something we hear a lot recently in the news and other places, that makes development less viable. Parking is very expensive, $60,000, $80,000, $100,000 per space, even more in many cases where you've got challenging soil conditions. So it's a significant cost for new development, something that we want to kind of keep in mind here as well. So our approach here really has been to try and take a bit of a balanced approach. We're not trying to be very aggressive, really reduce, ratchet down parking. We're not trying to provide enough parking spaces so that everyone has a space every time they ever want to go find one. We want to take into account existing policies. We want to take into account the way that things work in neighboring municipalities and other municipalities within the region and meet that functional demand for vehicles while still allowing the market to play a role where it needs to. Yeah, and really trying to maintain what is working well in the district while trying to tackle some of the problems that we've identified through working with staff. So as we went through and developed some of these new requirements, we relied on a number of different documents, a number of different data sources. Existing policies are probably the number one thing. There's a lot of established changes and adjustments and refinements that have happened to the zoning bylaw parking section over the years. We look at some of those established practice, like the alternative parking rate policy. We've undertaken some new surveys in mostly non-residential districts throughout the district And we've looked at some of the recent studies that have been published as well around parking requirements and also benchmarking against other municipalities within the region. So trying to take a context-sensitive approach that respects growth, that respects the context that we find ourselves in with different municipalities in the region. And yeah, trying to make sure that we're taking that balance approach that we talked about. So I'm going to talk about residential, commercial, industrial, and institutional parking separately. And I think maybe probably hold questions till the end if that works for everyone. When we think about residential parking right now, we've got sort of 1 or 2 rates that apply to residential buildings across the district. We've got this alternative parking rate policy that allows for some fairly significant reductions in exchange for transportation demand management measures. What we're looking to do is to break the district down into 3 geographic areas: a typical district-wide rate, a reduced set of parking rates within villages and town centers, the growth areas specifically, and of course, no parking requirements in the CODs. That's the provincial requirement that we're complying with there. And within those areas, we look at bifurcating out different land uses. So rental, social housing would have different rates. And we're looking to generally simplify the actual calculation of those rates. One of the themes that cuts across all the work we're doing here, trying to come up with a simpler set of numbers so that when someone's actually coming in with an application and they're running those numbers, they're a little bit easier to calculate. That goes for simplifying across different land uses. That also goes around how do we actually calculate those numbers in terms of a per unit basis or 1 every X number of bedrooms. One of the other things that we're looking at too as part of residential parking is visitor parking requirements. Right now, there's no visitor parking within TODs because those requirements were simply just removed. We're looking to reintroduce visitor parking within TODs. That's a need that we see as being important in the future. We talked a little bit about the alternative parking rate policy that relates to transportation demand management measures. Transportation demand management, TDM, that's essentially providing things as part of a development, whether that's programs like transit passes or physical built infrastructure like extra bike parking that helps to shift people away from taking personal vehicles around. Right now, the policy is fairly complex, and we are currently working with staff to develop a simpler, more refined policy that hits upon 3 main principles, trying to really simplify the application of those requirements and how they're calculated, moving away from a long menu of different options to something that's more prescribed. We're looking for clarity on costs for development. Something that we see across municipalities is that there's concern from industry around the cost of TDM with policies in place. And so we're looking to focus on things like programmatic requirements where you can calculate those costs easily. And finally, we're looking to narrow down the geographic focus of TDM. Right now, instead of allowing TDM across the district, we would require TDM only in growth areas and TOAs, where it's likely to have the most effect because that's where access to transit, access to higher density, local serving retail, things like that all are. Next up, commercial parking. One of the things that we've heard from staff is that there's challenges today with the mix of different uses in commercial buildings and challenges specifically with changing uses over time and through commercial lease up. Largely, that's the result of different requirements for different uses within the same building. And Tamsin went into this a little bit earlier on, so I won't go in and belabor that point. But what we're looking to do is generate blended rates. So if you have a mixed-use building with several CRUs at grade, you would apply a single rate to all of those buildings. Makes it a lot easier to figure out how much parking is required when you're building that building. And as you lease up that building, you're not going to see issues where 1 or 2 uses are taking up all of that parking space. And so that gives a lot of clarity, makes it a little bit easier for those developments to move ahead. And that also reflects the way that things work today. Most CD zones where you see mixed-use buildings being created are having some sort of a blended rate for those commercial uses. And so we're looking at that as a starting point for where we end up here. Next up, industrial parking. So we also see similar challenges with industrial spaces, changes of use, going to things like fitness centers or whatever else. Laser tag comes up very often when we're talking about industrial uses. We see that some older areas have challenges with parking supply. It keeps coming up as well. Newer buildings, some of those CD zones along Dollarton, for example, seem to be operating better. Right now, we're in the process of looking through some data that was collected both in Pemberton, along Dollarton, and some other areas of the district to refine those rates and figure out what a new blended rate might be. Today, there already is a blended rate within industrial areas, but it doesn't account for that sort of service and retail mix of uses that we are seeing more and more frequently. So we're going to be blending that in, coming up with a blended rate for that. Last but not least, talking a little bit about institutional parking. A little bit of a lighter touch here. Some of the changes that we're looking at here are primarily around simplifying how uses or requirements are calculated. So looking at rates per square foot or square meter, as opposed to rates per child, which are a little bit more fuzzy and difficult to understand at the application stage, and updating the rates for recreational uses, things like that, based on regional precedents and based on data that we've seen. Next up is goods and passenger loading. So right now, loading in the district's bylaw is quite simple. There's one size of loading space that's required, and it is only required in very specific circumstances where there's an overhead door being built as part of a building or some other fairly rare situations. So what we're hoping to do is generate a more complete list of requirements for loading that takes into account the different sizes of trucks that you might see. You can see in the images there, you've got sort of a standard white cube truck, you've got an Amazon delivery driver, a big highway trailer, and then you've got the passenger needs bottom there. So we want to make sure that we're providing space for all these different kinds of uses where it makes sense, where it's contextually relevant. And that means adding some different sizes of space within the bylaw, and I won't get into too much detail on that, but happy to answer questions. And we're developing a list of new requirements for different land uses based on regional precedents. Lastly, bicycle parking. There's already a fairly robust policy around bicycle parking that's in a separate policy outside of the zoning bylaw. We're looking to bring in many of the requirements within that policy into the zoning bylaw with some tweaks and adjustments to take into account data that we've seen around, for example, residential bicycle parking, and moving in some entry facilities like bike wash stations, showers, things like that, so that they're explicitly required within the zoning bylaw instead of only in that separate policy. So there'll be requirements on every development, not just CD1s or CDs. And that is it for the parking so far. So it's a pretty high level summary. There's obviously a lot more detail to the work that's happening right now, but happy to answer any questions.
I had a question, and I'm trying to remember which slide it was on. You said blended rate very early on in your presentation. You talked about, I think that was on slide 4, but at any rate, I'm trying to understand what, are you protecting, residential spaces from commercial overflow or commercial spaces from residential overflow?
We are trying to rationalize the amount of commercial parking that's being provided so that in aggregate, when you look at a building that might have 6 or 7 different CRUs, that you're averaging out the requirement for all those different uses in a way that sort of works pretty much all the time. If you had 7 successful restaurants that were all busy at the same time, you're going to have some parking challenges, but that's very unlikely. We don't see that happening very often. And so based on the data that we're seeing, we can estimate on average a typical CRU environment, typical mixed-use environment, the kind of parking demand you might see throughout the day.
You said though at the time, you said that you didn't want one use to be dominated by another use.
Yeah, sorry, okay, to clarify that, if you, for example, had a restaurant move in, one per 15 square meters requirement, and you've got, that requires 25 parking spaces, you might only have 30 parking spaces within your commercial component. So now the other 2 or 3 CRUs that are in that building, they come in as a general retail at 1 per 40, and now there's only 5 spaces left for them between the 3 CRUs, and there's just not enough space. And so you end up in situations where individual businesses have to apply for a variance because there are parking spaces available for that use underneath the zoning bylaw requirements. Correct me if that.
No, that's how we've been using it. So we would look at a building that say had 10 CRUs and then make an informed, based on experts like John, decision on what percentage would be likely to be restaurants over the life of it, and then take that kind of 1 per 15 and compare it with the 1 per 45 for other commercial uses, and then do a blended rate that usually is somewhere between 1 per 30 or 1 per 35, 1 per 40, depending on the neighborhood, and apply that to the whole building. And that's really nice because it means you're kind of one and done. It doesn't matter who goes into each of those retail spaces. They share the parking that's provided. and that you're not doing a new calculation for each tenant improvement. And it seems to be working well.
Mr. Miller.
Worship, just to clarify, commercial retail unit or CRU, we're using that term, so I just want to make sure everybody's aware of that. So we're talking about the commercial spaces and doing a blended rate amongst the commercial uses. I think you might have been, your question might have hinted at, are we talking about blending the residential
With the
demand
mixed
with the
use.
commercial demand? Like a mixed use situation? I think the example staff have given are with the commercial units. So that we don't, again, create these one-off situations in the commercial side, instead of we can have blended as described in their examples.
Yeah, I don't know how you do that after day one, because was it Ross and Mountain, where all of a sudden a Starbucks went into an otherwise sleepy little commercial space. You all of a sudden had the businesses, the neighbors being dominated by it. But when the building was built, it had a very different makeup of tenants. Therefore, it would have a very different blended rate amongst the businesses anticipated. And it didn't anticipate that in future it would have an absolutely massive coffee shop in it. But yeah, okay. No, I wasn't sure if it was between the mixed uses and versus tenants competing with each other for space. Again, I still think there's an argument for. And I'd be curious if any municipality has given special provisions for nighttime primary versus daytime primary.
We do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
we have that.
it's, where is that embedded in ours?
So it's in a couple of different places.
Okay.
But there's a clause that essentially says, if you want to use your neighbor's use because they've got extra spaces at a different time of day, then if you enter into agreement under covenant, you can be considered for a certain
So
percentage.
the policy allows for it, it doesn't dictate it, it allows people to come up with their own agreement over it.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, there's sort of two areas where that comes up. One is looking at offsite parking. Because of time to decide whether you actually have a covenant with a neighbor that says, you're a medical office, I'm a laser tag to stick with the theme. And we only need our parking for 7 hours on the weekends or whatever. So we're gonna actually write an agreement that leases those space functionally for the long term. There's also shared parking within a building where you might have, for example, residential visitor use shared with a retail use, because those retail uses peak middle of the day, typically on average, residential visitor peaks in the evenings and weekends. So you have a sort of a balance that you can achieve there, and you can reduce the overall number of parking because of that. That's something that we're introducing into the bylaw without trying to be too prescriptive about it, but opening the door to that if a consultant can show that that makes sense for that particular site.
So at this time, we allow it, but we don't prescribe it.
Yeah.
What happens when businesses change and if it's under covenant, you're restricting type of business that may want to come in?
You would be, yeah. And typically you would look at the overall category of use rather than a particular individual business when you're looking at it on that kind of larger sense. The laser tag example, that would be a restriction in that case. And if that laser tag went out, then it could come in and it would potentially have the advantage of that additional parking, but it would impede that other development that's borrowing the spaces from.
As
I just wanted to mention there is also the variance process available.
For the next tenant coming in?
Yeah, yeah, when the site-specific situation warrants a variance, there is a process.
The variance is, from my perspective, is a very paperwork action. It doesn't solve the demand that you might have.
Hence the update.
Yeah. And this is something that is in use in lots of other municipalities in the region as well. So it's a fairly common tool.
Got Councilor Murray.
I can't help but chuckle a bit about this one because we did this over 30 years ago. We put this system in place, and we put it in place in Deep Cove on the development that is next to the cultural center where Arms Reach is. And the reason it happened was because Arms Reach was, or the Savory at the time, was originally supposed to be a retail space. And the community, when the Savory closed, when the land was sold to the developer, the community petitioned to have the restaurant come back into the space. And it wasn't contemplated that the space would incorporate a restaurant. And then there was the Deep Cove Yacht Club that had a big, large parking lot, and the district took that away and built a terraced set of stairs down to the waterfront. And so, that's illustrating sometimes we create these problems. But that's exactly what they do. So in the daytime, the parking for the retail space on Gallant is used in the daytime by both, it's been used by both a commercial operator and a retail operator. And then in the evening, it can be used by the yacht club or the restaurant. And they've shared those spaces interchangeably for over 30 years. And they had to do it that way. They didn't hire a consultant to come in and assess it. It was just an approach that needed to happen because of the limited geography and the limited amount of parking in the cove. So it's not without precedent in the municipality. If we're going to do an assessment about our parking, can we please phone the West Van and the city? And when our contracts for pay parking in our parks come back up, can all three of us agree on one parking provider? So we don't have to have multiple apps on our phone every time we go into a different space that requires pay parking. I just wanted to take that opportunity since we're talking about parking. I think the mayor, when he said that, it all sounds good, but you can't implement a lot of this stuff on day one. And if I look at some of the areas that we've already created, significant parking challenges, Bond Street at Mountain Highway comes to mind when we have, social housing, rental housing, and then a long-term care facility for seniors and very, very limited parking. And right now, all the parking is on Bond Street is where people are parking to use that long-term care facility. Dollarton, Old Maplewood, Old Dollarton Highway is filled with cars from local businesses, residents, and contractors. And we actually made a decision, the previous council made a decision to allow a market development on Old Dollarton just behind Stong's that was a market strata development. And then the developer turned around and wanted it to be rental and made a deal with the municipality that they'd put rental in if we took out a level of parking. And that area down there is so congested with cars and such limited parking, and we're only adding more density. And I don't know where all these cars are going to go. If hindsight's 2020, those big empty parking lots in those business parks, I mean, I kick myself that we didn't look at sharing those lots as part of the zoning with the evening parking needs going into the future, because it's almost criminal that they sit there empty and we're adding all this density and we're landlocked down there. I mean, there's going to be nowhere to park, and we're going to spill over into all sorts of different areas. And there's no plan. There's no plan for, Lower Lynn in regards to the impacts of parking. And we did it to our own works yard. We took parking away from our own employees at the works yard when we rezoned that light industrial land to residential. It's so limited. And we're trying to squeeze more people in, and a lot of the areas, there's people getting on the bus. We know the mode shift is changing, although we just don't have the kind of frequent service we need. But areas like the Seymour, we just don't get that service because it is an area of sprawl, and most people have a car because it's quicker to get around in a car than on the bus. So just to the consultant, do you drive around to these areas, and how do you assess them? How do you come up with these recommendations and this information?
So I guess there's a few things to unpack there. Maybe I want to first talk a little bit about Bond Street and Old Belverton, which you brought up. Bond Street's within the transit-oriented area, and so obviously, unfortunately, there's no way to require residential parking within that area. But one of the changes that we are looking to make is to require visitor parking within the TOA, so there would be some space for visitors. Another change is around passenger loading, which is something that we see as being more important for some
For
of those
what kind of loading, sorry?
passenger loading. So
Oh.
somewhere for your driver to come or your pizza delivery guy to stop for 30 seconds to drop off. Those kind of things are more important where folks don't necessarily have access to vehicle parking for themselves. So those are some of the things we're trying to do to mitigate those impacts in those areas where we're not able to require residential parking. In other areas like Maplewood, we are seeing this as a growth area, an area that is changing. So we're looking at somewhat reduced parking rates there, although we're currently resolving exactly what rates would be recommended, in part to sort of acknowledge the fact that there are some of those existing challenges. But I think the fundamental question here is really around the interaction between curbside space and curbside use and off-street parking, which is something that we can require through the zoning bylaw. Really, at the end of the day, those two different kinds of parking, those two different resources need to work together as a system. And so it's really important where you do have areas with parking pressure to find ways to manage the street to ensure that those who most need access and the kinds of parking access that you want to allow for are able to be accommodated. And that also sends a signal to development that they need to provide for their uses on site and not simply rely on the street as sort of an overflow opportunity.
But I'd say that that's happening anyway because developers are charging, $150 a month for parking in undergrounds of rental buildings. And just like at Northwoods, people park on the street rather than pay the monthly rate, and that's going to happen at the other quad rail project that's being currently built now, and it's probably going to happen at the next one that they're going to build. They're just going to, people will just find ways. They'll go into the the other residential areas in the neighborhood and park there. So, those are, I don't know how we deal with those areas. I see constantly, Amazon vans parked in the bike lanes. There aren't enough laybys for people to pull in and out of. And
Nope.
certainly we have those kinds of problems in single family neighborhoods too, or areas that are bordering on, the Lynn Valley Town Center, for instance. The uses up there, the private schools, the challenges of parking for those kinds of operations continue to be challenging. Business owners, I think Councillor Forbes brought up Lynn Valley Mall and the parking challenges up there when it rains. Part of that, a significant part of
It's
that lot now
atrocious.
is used for employee parking. And spots that were ultimately used for the patrons of the mall are being used for employees right now. And for Stong's at Northwoods, there is no employee parking. There's zero. All the employees park on the street. So how do we get around those kinds of restrictions that businesses are putting in place because of the limited access on their footprint for people to come and use their services?
Yeah, maybe one data point to respond to that. We did do counts at one of those locations, the Save on Foods in Lynn Valley. That underground parking at its busiest was about 43% full on a Saturday that was raining. So, there is still parking capacity within that area, certainly.
Because nobody wants to go underground,
One of
genius.
the things that we are considering is looking at breaking out rates for larger grocery stores to acknowledge the fact that those sorts of anchor tenants can generate a little more intensity at times of the week. So we are looking to acknowledge those things as part of that overall strategy.
I think we need, as well, and Councillor Pope brought this up in a previous discussion in regards to the underground parking lot up in Edgemont and, how it's often not utilized. People don't want to go into underground parking lots. Maybe they're not well lit. They don't feel safe. There's a lot of ways to deal with those underground parking lots to make people actually use them. And then wayfinding to those lots. You know, sometimes we have more signs that we know what to do with, and you know, they just confuse people and people ignore it. And then there's that effective wayfinding where people are actually driven to those underground lots so they can use them. So, yeah, I think parking in some of these areas is going to only become, and you know, when that seniors home on Mountain and Rupert was built, there was actually a suggestion by one of our council members at the time that people use the Canadian Tire parking lot to park in when they go there. And it's just spilling over, you know, those kinds of areas are just going to spill over into the commercial zones that are trying to conduct business because we're not putting in, you know, for fear of cost or whatever, the appropriate amount of parking in some of these places. And if there was the appropriate amount of parking for that facility, people would use it because there's no other choice. But when there's another choice that's at grade, they're going to use it. And just like in our parks and in Deep Cove, especially, is a great example. People don't care about the parking restrictions down there. They'll just pay the fine. They'll just pay the ticket. And I can just see those empty parking lots, Mayor Little, as density becomes the nature down in Maplewood. I bet
Yep.
those empty parking lots are going to have to make some changes to prevent people from parking
Mhm.
in there overnight.
Bingo.
I will just say, I think you've given pretty good coverage of the reasons why people don't like underground parking lots. The other one is, we've all moved up to SUVs largely in our community, and parking in an underground with pillars is generally really tight. And
Yeah, exactly right.
versus open above ground where there's no pillars between and people can come in and out of the spaces relatively smoothly.
Well, and add to that, Mayor Little, that
People should drive K trucks, I think is.
yeah, no, they shouldn't, because there are some really bad issues with those things as well, as I've experienced.
Same.
One of the other things though is, you know, we talk about, you know, trying to get people that you know, are coming off the North Shore over here to work. You know, there's no way you're getting a panel van with a ladder on your roof underneath
Nope.
an underground parking lot. It's just not happening, you know. So I think a lot of these times we try to figure out, you know, solutions to these problems, but you know, we're creating some of the problems ourselves.
Thank you, Councillor Hanson.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Mike, for your presentation. Thanks, staff, for all this work. Observation that I'd make is this is very conceptual. This is there's a lot of detail to be filled in before we can, I think, analyze a lot of this to some degree. I look at the parking, residential parking, so the district-wide, reduced rates in town, village centers, the transit-oriented development, reduced rates for rental and social housing, and simplified per unit requirements. Well, I think we can comment on that a lot more meaningfully when we have a few more details as to what you're proposing for those categories. So the question that I'd ask is, when do you expect those details to be coming forward? When are you going to flesh this out into a program that has some more specific recommendations? I do agree with the overall tenor of the proposal. When is that going to be fleshed out a little bit more? And will we get a chance to comment on it in a more specific way when the details are in front of us? And I believe our powers of analyzing it will be better because those details will bring out the issue, in my view. Thank you.
So we have fleshed out those details. Right now, we're working with staff on refining those so that we have a complete package that we can provide for that review. And I guess there will be an opportunity, of course, to review at some point before.
We're essentially working on, we've drafted the entire document, but it's with input like this, we can kind of refine and refine. And then we're hoping to get a refined version back to the public and yourselves so that you can see all the details. Because I think what we heard loud and clear tonight was it's time for the details. So we like to return that to you so you can really scratch the surface a little bit more and get in the weeds with us.
Okay, thank you very much.
you. I don't have anyone else signed up to speak at this point, so I'll just do a double check in.
Or done.
Mr. Faha, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to flag part of the reason we wanted to make sure our approach was correct before we get into the details. I think the main thing to take away here is that we do have existing policies through our alternative parking rate policy that has parking rates. The problem is that those rates aren't actually in the zoning bylaws. So what we're having to do is essentially negotiate development by development on what an appropriate rate is balanced against a transportation demand management. So literally it's a suite of options and you have to negotiate with every single development on a case-by-case basis. What we're wanting to do is embed those rates into the zoning bylaw and require TDM as a mandatory provision. So in that way, you do the carrot and the stick at the same time. You would reduce the rates, but you would require mandatory TDM and no more of this like negotiation, what a TDM value is. It would be a monetary value in the form of transit passes, transit credits, car share memberships, and we would develop some sort of policy so that there's a lot more certainty and transparency for the development community, and it makes Tamsin's life a lot easier when she's reviewing a development application to make sure that the rules are clear.
Good. Councilor Ma?
Thank you for that. I was just wondering, similar to the other approach where you have shelf-ready, zones, would that same approach apply here? Like, if there's a development in a town center like Mid Valley, here's your criteria, but if someone was to do it at I don't know, Queensdale or something else where it's not as high density, would that be a separate standard? So it's kind of like certain criteria.
Yeah, so that's part of that sort of 3 tiers approach that we're looking at. We've got the TOAs.
Yeah.
We know that 0 residential minimums are challenging for a lot of folks. We're looking to balance that out with requirements for visitor, other things like that. We're looking at the growth centers in Maplewood, Lynn Valley, other areas. Those areas, we've got better access to transit, we've got more retail, we've got more opportunities for folks to potentially live without a car, get by with 1 car. And so there's an opportunity to have slightly reduced parking rates in those areas. But outside of that, in other parts of the district, we do acknowledge there's that suburban context. You're further from retail, you're further from those transit opportunities. And so parking requirements are going to be higher. And so we're trying to acknowledge, we want to make sure that the kinds of developments that you want to see are not being held up because of that site-by-site negotiation that happens right now. And that there is a rate that fits for each type of development that you do want to see, whether that's new, single detached housing, or whether that's new multifamily 6-story buildings with retail.
Would another criteria be access or proximity to mobility infrastructure like bike lanes? Or is that something that is a little more complex because you have a bike lane doesn't necessarily mean that,
We use those growth centers as sort of a proxy for access to transit, access to cycling, access to local services. All those things kind of come together, and to try and map those out individually would be very, very complicated. So yeah, we're focusing on those growth centers as a site plan.
Just from my experience and talking with some people that are, more into cycling, they still have their cars too, right? So
exactly, yeah. Yeah, a bike lane is not a reason for everyone to sell their car the next day, obviously, right? Okay. So yeah, we want to.
Yeah, I know the tendency. Obviously, a developer, when they're putting together their pro forma, their goal is to get their cost down as much as possible, and so there's going to be pressure on them to reduce the number of parking stalls. I don't want us, as the regulator, to view an empty parking stall as being the worst thing in the world. First of all, it's our flexible space. It's where the snow goes when we have a snow time. It's where the scouts go with their Christmas trees. It's where the pop-up, garden shop shows up in a parking lot that's underutilized space. When there's a major renovation that has to take place in that space, that's where the dusty, rusty, materials and the paint buckets go to get the project done. putting a target on excess parking still needs to be justified in this. Wherever we reasonably can, some flexible space, I think, is reasonable. And so I know that we're under pressure to reduce the cost to help developers get a project that's more economically viable for them. But at the same time, we're making future decisions for how the community can use their space in general. Thank goodness we had ample parking regulations in the past, because otherwise we wouldn't have all the Tesla charging stations that showed up in all those excess spaces that everybody uses because their apartment buildings don't have charging stations. And so by not having that flexible space, we're making decisions for how the community can use the area in future rather than letting it be a little more flexible. So I don't see an empty parking space necessarily as a bad thing. I want to get the number right, but we reuse those spaces for a variety of different uses, and the community benefits from it. So I'm very concerned that our tendency to lower the parking requirements is leading to a level of, we'll just call it a tension in the community, where
It's
I
idiotic
don't
is
know
what
where
it
I'm gonna
is.
park my car.
Well pointed
And
out,
so
Mike.
now my car with some of my tools in it is 4 blocks away from my house, and you just constantly have this feeling in the pit of your stomach that tonight's the night your car is going to get all the tools taken off of it. And what are you going to do for work the next day? Like there are people who have tension about where their car is parked and how far away from their house and whether it'll be safe. And I think
100%.
we don't think in those terms when we're creating the space. We think in terms of whether the project will go ahead or not. The ultimate challenge we've had in the Sealand area, I think, is as it gets built out, you're going to see such a scarcity of parking available that it's going to create an anxiety and a tension in the community. You're already starting to see it. Bond Street up. People are fighting neighbor to neighbor over a parking stall, and it's a real challenge if we underbuild it. So I hope we don't just look at it as being an empty parking spot. Well, we got the number wrong, therefore we'll go lower next time. It's our flexible space. It's how community functions and changes over time. I'm not worried about some empty space. Councillor Muriel.
Well, I was just going to agree with yourself, but also Councillor Hanson in regards to we need some of the details in order to understand what decisions we're going to be making. And then Mr. Taha made the comment that, well, we wanted to make sure that we were on the right track before we dive into the details. So here we have a bit of a
Chicken and egg.
We're at loggerheads here because we won't know if we're on the right track unless we have those details. It cannot be, as Mayor Little pointed out, one size fits all. There's all sorts of different reasons for those empty spaces, but there's also different parts of the community, like using TDM, bus passes, as part of that TDM. Well, that's great if you live on, in a busy area with frequent transit. But if you live where I live, there's just not that regular transit service. And, Maplewood is where I live. So, it's not going to work the same in one part of the community as it will in another. We once had a park and ride at Phibbs Exchange, and we took it out and we built a social housing project on it. So that's why more people drive, because they used to be able to go, if they worked downtown, they would go park in that parking lot and take the bus. But now there's nowhere to park. So every action, there's a reaction. And, I agree. We're going to have, it's going to be a rude awakening when some of these town centers are built out. And even the decisions we're making right now, reducing the amount of parking when we're building out these areas, what happens? And yes, I know the idea is, well, if we don't make it, if we make it inconvenient for people to drive a car, they'll take the bus, but there is no bus. The service is not frequent enough. And, even we talk about the bus rapid transit, we have the plan, but do we have the dough to buy the buses? I think not at this point. So, we have to do this carefully. And we're going to run into problems. Here we're talking about the commercial viability and the vibrancy of these neighborhoods that we're building, but do we actually have the infrastructure to support what we truly want? You know, and I don't know the answer to those questions. Right now, it's challenging. The city of North Vancouver has been building for 30 years intensely, and they just recently put in pay parking. You know, we're looking at it before our town centers even build out. In addition to the nations, and the Squamish Nation is already notified us that they are going ahead with, I think it's 3 buildings on reserve lands in Lynn Creek. And what kind of parking requirements are they putting into those buildings? Do we know that? Do we have that information?
Looking around, I'm not sure that we would have received the early proposals. Mr. Milburn?
Chair of council, what we have that's publicly available.
Yeah.
I don't have those numbers.
But I think it's something that we need to inquire about. They're going ahead. You know, they've indicated to us that they're moving ahead with that project. So it would be nice to know what kind of parking is going to be available in that, because ultimately it could spill out into the municipal boundaries. And we're already having challenges with the amount of accessible parking for the people that live in Lynn Creek right now, including the businesses. So I think we need the details in order to understand what direction we're going in, and have a more broader discussion about TDM and what's working and what's not working, and you know what's going to be in place. Because if you're going to require TDM management, then you're going to have to actually put up the alternatives in order to make it successful. And I don't know if we can do that.
Thank you for your comments. Looking around, I don't see any other speakers queued up to speak. Have you heard what you need to hear?
Yes.
So,
It's been really helpful, so thank you again for your patience and for just giving us your input. There are so many reasons that are competing interests, especially on the commercial piece that we spent a lot of time on earlier, and again, 2 weeks ago. We don't want to go too far in one direction before we know that this is where you want us to go when we've got competing interests. So it really is helpful, and it's not because we haven't thought about these things, it's just there are different ways we could go, and so getting your input is great. We're gonna have to take some of it away to figure out how quickly we can come back to certain cases, but yeah, we've got, it was definitely a very useful evening, so thank you for your time.
Just have,
So
I wanted to, do you want to?
oh yeah, I was just gonna say, I guess too, one of the things we talked about was that balancing act of trying to avoid, you have problems with too much parking and too little parking. I think the conversation today is really helpful in sort of guiding us to where your collective thoughts are on that balance. So that'll help us understand what we need to get to for the work.
our policy on council workshops is that we do public input if we are not over time. We are over time. And so we'll seek public input before this forms decisions in the future. But members of the public can also share their views virtually or via email in the interim time. So at this point, we've completed the business that we've set out to complete today. I'll accept adjournment. Councillor Ma, ready to call the question, all in favor, Councillor Ma, Karen.
Night.
I want to thank staff for their presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you to consultants, and thank you everyone for your time. Have a great night.
Thank you, John.